Yeah, I think we're just going live. Yeah.
Okay, diffuser, yes.
Yeah, I think we are live now.
Yes, live, but not record. Okay, right. Okay, that's it.
Perfect. Perfect. Yes.
Great. So welcome back for our last day of conversation presentation on Derrida and literature. And I'll begin with two personal vignettes to talk about the really complex links between Derrida and Maurice Blanchot. When I was a student at the École Normale Supérieure, quite at the beginning, I met a very nice young American man whose name may be known to some of you, Jeffrey Melman, who's translated a lot, published a lot. And we met in a meeting that was totally administrative because with another friend, we were trying to remember the beginning of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock. And we were stumbling over the first lines, and just behind us, this young man with a perfect diction recites us the beginning of the poem. And wow. So thanks to Jeffrey, we remained friends all those years. I met Svetan Todorov, who, I don't know whether you know his name, a Bulgarian man who had come to France and who wrote a lot about semiotics and became a public intellectual, very interesting man. At that time, I went to a party where at his place, and we chatted a little bit. And I said I was reading Derrida, and at that time, very dismissive. He said, "Oh well, Derrida, everything Derrida writes has been already said by Maurice Blanchot. Read Blanchot." And I hadn't really read Blanchot. I said, okay, maybe. And then I saw some similarities, but I would not have said exactly the same. It is true that there is a lot in the earlier Derrida that looks back to Blanchot. But if you remember, I began by insisting that even Roland Barthes was also reading Maurice Blanchot. Maurice Blanchot, I don't know whether you know much about him. What one knows is that he didn't want to be photographed, so there was only one photograph, and he didn't want that photograph to be reproduced. Was a very tall, very thin, very blonde man, often sick, very sick, most of his life, but he had a long life and a long career, and he wrote a lot. What interested Derrida, I can say, mostly, were not his essays on literature, and he wrote quite a lot, but his novels, his récits, narratives, and the pieces that are in between. The second little vignette I want to mention comes from another friend of Derrida, Roger Laporte, who died in 2001, who wrote a lot, was a philosophy teacher in the south of France. His main book, I'll write the name here, Laporte Roger, and Moriendo, and he knew, of course, Derrida, and he also was in an exchange of letters with Blanchot. Blanchot, you could not really meet him. You could exchange letters and he would immediately reply. And he noticed that immediately after Derrida started publishing his first essays, Blanchot rewrote quite a number of earlier essays, each time changing parole, speech, to writing. So, in spite of what Svetan Todorov was saying, I think there was a mutual interaction very early on between the younger Derrida and Maurice Blanchot, who in the 60s was already a myth. What has to be said about Blanchot, and it has been investigated, explored more recently, is the tricky question of Blanchot's politics. In a sense, Blanchot was a little like Paul de Man, intellectuals who were, you might say, on the right before the war, the Second World War, of course, and during the war, moved to the left, and to the point that Blanchot was extremely hostile to de Gaulle. Remember, he was one of those who launched the manifesto of the 121, calling for disobedience and the rejection of the French war in Algeria. In 1968, even more, he was on the barricades with the young people in Paris. So this is funny, strange evolution from a sort of extreme right that was not fascist, not anti-Semitic, but we might say reactionary, to an extreme left. And still today, his work is quite tantalizing. But I'll begin by sharing with you a little film that I hope I can share, in which you see a much younger Derrida. It corresponds to the...
L'antisémitisme serait-il délirant? Reste la faute capitale.
Le commencement qui s'impose à moi, c'est vraiment l'impossibilité de parler de Blanchot et de l'œuvre de Blanchot en général, bien sûr, mais dans ces conditions-là en particulier. Ce qui fait que quand on se trouve dans cette situation,
Can you see?
Le sentiment qu'il
Yes,
faut
you can see it here. Yeah.
et qu'en même temps c'est impossible, jamais on ne sent mieux la nécessité, la justesse et la justice de son retrait. Par la simple impossibilité qu'on ressent de dire quelque chose qui puisse se mesurer à cette pensée, à cette œuvre, et s'y mesurer dans ces conditions-là. Je crois qu'il faut parler aujourd'hui de Blanchot dans ces conditions aussi. L'attente de l'oubli est peut-être le dernier livre qui est une forme de fiction. L'événement, ce dont on peut penser qu'il donne lieu à narration, à récit, ne se produisant comme événement que dans la mesure où il n'est ni vrai ni faux, hein, et où le sens de fiction se met à trembler, n'est-ce pas? L'adresse qui retentit régulièrement, quelquefois en italique, quelquefois non, quelquefois sous la forme du tutoiement, quelquefois sous la forme du vous, c'est fais en sorte que je puisse te parler, faites en sorte que je puisse vous parler. Elle vient depuis un lieu qui est donc en principe antérieur à la parole, et qui parle déjà d'incertitude, d'une parole qui a commencé avant elle-même. C'est ou bien de savoir si elle va pouvoir avoir lieu comme parole, ou si elle va pouvoir s'adresser à toi ou à vous. Cette demande est une demande impossible. Il est dit dans l'attente publique que ce qui est ainsi demandé, c'est l'impossible. L'entretien infini, 1969, c'est un livre qui rassemble un grand nombre de textes très, très riches sur un grand nombre d'auteurs et de thèmes différents, précédé par 2 introductions. Un texte théorique et neutre, et puis la mise en scène d'un entretien fictif. Ce qui compte dans l'entretien, c'est la venue. L'autre vient, je viens. C'est une expérience de l'interruption, c'est-à-dire de la séparation infinie. Et là, on retrouve des motifs qui seront communs à Lévinas et à Blanchot, où, naturellement, l'expérience de l'autre comme autre et l'expérience d'une distance infinie, d'une interruption, d'une séparation. En 71, donc 2 ans après, L'amitié, autre livre immense, un livre 1 sur l'amitié en général et l'amitié au singulier, mais qui évidemment, parmi tous les amis ou textes amis ou pensées amies sur lesquels ce livre veille, si on peut dire, ou qui veille sur ce livre, le nom de bataille occupe une place singulière parmi les places singulières, si je peux dire. Il y a dans l'amitié un renoncement à la mémoire, à la présence, à la proximité, à la connaissance de l'autre même. Autrement dit, tout ce que la tradition philosophique avait inscrit sous le concept d'amitié, la familiarité, la présence de l'autre, la connaissance, la fidélité, etc., tout cela est radicalement contredit par l'expérience de l'amitié dont parle Blanchot. Parce que l'œuvre de Blanchot, qui est, tout le monde le sait, ses amis, ses admirateurs, mais aussi ses adversaires de tous ordres. L'œuvre de Blanchot est une des grandes œuvres, un des grands événements de ce siècle et au-delà de ce siècle, qui chemine plus ou moins souterrainement, en tout cas discrètement, gagne en intensité de présence, et à mesure que cette intensité ou cette nécessité s'impose, fait naître une sorte d'appréhension, de peur aussi, de ressentiment. Et donc, je crois qu'il est temps que ce suspens soit suspendu, cesse. Pour cela, je crois qu'il est temps que le caractère presque clandestin de l'œuvre de Blanchot et de ses initiés change d'espace. En tout cas, dans cet espoir, je prends le risque de l'échec dont je parlais tout à l'heure.
So you have seen, so I hope you could hear Derrida's way.
Wouldn't let yourself be photographed, and you.
Sorry. Yeah. Am I frozen here? Can you see me?
Yes, Professor, yes.
Okay, very good, very good. I was frozen for a while. So what you can see is how Derrida is careful in presenting Blanchot's main themes and how he insists upon Blanchot's, I would say, secrecy, the fact that he was a sort of what we would call in French, éminence grise, that is, he was respected by everybody in the literary milieu, would send many, many letters every day, intervene. And I remember very well how when I had that little press I mentioned at the beginning, Ulysse fin de siècle, quite discreetly, Blanchot, who had been one of the subscribers of our endeavor, of our enterprise from the start, asked us to help one of his friend, Pierre Madol, publish a book that had been rejected everywhere. We did it, and Blanchot then thanked us, but he did not appear. If you didn't know, he did not appear. He just helped his friend. His friend may not even have known that it was because of Blanchot we did it, and it was quite worthwhile. But at the same time, as Derrida insists, Blanchot scares people, especially because his style is relatively cryptic, difficult from the start. The texts he writes are very enigmatic, most of them the fiction, and there's one text that Derrida keeps returning to, La folie du jour, the madness of the day, which is extraordinary, but so difficult to understand, and although it is written in very simple French. I know that recently in China, Blanchot has been translated, all of Blanchot, and one of my friends who is teaching in Wuhan, Sophie, is working on Blanchot in China. So, and he's really appreciated in China. There's something in his style that is a little aphoristic, you might say, Buddhist almost, Zen, that hits something in Chinese readers. So there is a future for Blanchot. And of course, there is a question of ethics, politics, and one point Derrida made in passing that is quite important is that very early, Maurice Blanchot and Emmanuel Levinas met as students in Strasbourg. Levinas, remember, coming from Lithuania, and Blanchot from Burgundy, an old French family. And they remain friends all their lives and engage in a sort of critical dialogue. And a lot of what Blanchot writes is often a response or a modification of positions held, defended by Levinas. Of course, Levinas is more of a philosopher, philosopher, but as we'll see in a number of texts, Blanchot reads philosophy. At the same time, he is that typical French creature, the undefinable writer, whose existence was marked by reading and reviewing. And Blanchot, it's well known, didn't have a fortune of his own and made a living by being a sort of journalist, a literary journalist. And so his essays from even the Second World War, and even before, are extremely numerous. He would often republish them, rewrite them. And for instance, this enormous book that Derrida mentioned, The Infinite Conversation, it might be a good place to begin reading Blanchot, 1969. Not so difficult. Many essays on people like Gertrude Stein, Valéry, and others, always with a perfect edge and a perfect critical assessment. At the same time, if you know, perhaps some of you, the space of literature and the writing of the disaster, there is a certain proximity with psychoanalysis in Blanchot, and often he talks about primal scene or the Oedipal element, but we don't know much about his life. There is a very good biography, but with many holes, gaps, and so on. The other friendship I want to mention, because we'll return to him in the last part with Glas, was with Bataille. That friendship started a little later, actually during the Second World War. Georges Bataille had already published a lot, and in the same way, Bataille and Blanchot exchanged regularly, to the point that we know this, and I worked a little bit on this. Blanchot wrote a novel about his love affair with a woman who had been Bataille's mistress for a while. So we'll return to this complex file with many interesting, I would say, cross-references and dialogues. And I'll begin here with one short text that I reproduced, which comes from one of the first essays that were so important for many people, which to share. The essay that is translated into English as From Dread to Language. Dread may not be the best term to translate angoisse. Anxiety would be today the term we would use. At the same time, anxiety has perhaps something that is too medical. Angoisse was a term that was used a lot at the time of existentialism. Blanchot was never an existentialist. He was too much, I would say, a Kabbalist of literature. But he talks a lot about the anxiety of death. He had read Heidegger like everybody else. And this is a meditation on the paradoxes entailed by the act of writing. And you have here, the writer could, of course, not write. That is true. Why would man, at the farthest reach of solitude, write, I am alone? Or like Kierkegaard, I am all alone here? And so this a meditation on writing and silence is a key to Blanchot. But here you see this, if he lands at the outer limit. When he says he, one has to understand that in French, l'écrivain, until very recently, now you can say l'écrivaine, but in Blanchot's time, the he simply derives from the fact that l'écrivain is in a masculine, like in German, der Dichter. Then you have this sentence that has been often glossed. The writer finds himself in this more and more comical condition of having nothing to write, having no means of writing it, and of being forced by an extreme necessity to keep writing it. Having nothing to express should be taken in the simplest sense. Whatever he wants to say, it is nothing. The world, things, knowledge are for him only reference points across the void. And he himself is already reduced to nothing. Nothing is material. I have nothing to say. As you can see here, and I wanted to establish a certain arc, we have moved a long way from Sartre's, I would say, optimism about the writer who has something to say. For Sartre, it is clear that if you are a writer, it is because you have something to say. If you don't have something to say, you're not a good writer. You're not a writer. You're disqualified. You're just a narcissist, an indulgent aesthete, and so on. Blanchot starts from exactly the opposite view. A good writer, an important writer like Kierkegaard here, or Kafka, and we know that Blanchot had translated, this is a book that was published 2 years ago, very interesting book, showing that all his life, Blanchot translated from Kafka himself, and they never published the translation. There's a lot to explore for those of you who might be interested in Blanchot. You would have to go to Harvard and see all the archives and all the unpublished manuscripts. It's a lot. But anyway, Kafka and Kierkegaard were two important points of reference for Blanchot. But Blanchot starts from the opposite consideration that you can be a writer and not write, or you can be a writer and not be able to write, or you can be a writer who has nothing to express. I think this essay was written in 1941. Of course, during the war, at a time when Blanchot was hesitant about his political position, he had accepted certain offices in compromise publication, but soon got away from them and then quickly retired to his countryside house in Burgundy. And this is soon after having written this, that something quite extraordinary happened to him. At the end of the war, his village had seen a few resistance attacks. And so as a reprisal, the German troops came and took all the men, including Blanchot, and put them against a wall and were going to execute them. At the last minute, for no clear reason, perhaps because Blanchot looked very much like a distinguished, noble person, and the others were, of course, peasants, someone made a sign and told Blanchot, run, you can leave, which he did, and all the others were shot to death. And so this is a little text that he wrote later on, the instant of my death, the moment when he thought, that's it, I'm going to be killed. And that is, of course, something that Derrida discussed at some point, at some length, and quite often. But here, you see, I want to insist, maybe it's an exaggerated opposition, that as you can see, what Blanchot did is the exact inverse of what Sartre did. Sartre wrote a lot during the war, Blanchot not so much. He withdrew and he decided not to appear. He didn't take position like Sartre did. Again, I insinuate this, but I believe that it was to apologize for the fact that he was quite happy to be feted as a new, young, emerging writer in Paris during the occupation. Meanwhile, Blanchot had disappeared from the same stage. Somebody, and I know that some of you will have recognized the reference, will realize that this is very close to what Samuel Beckett was to write a little later in his conversations with his friend Georges Dutuit. Beckett, in the 3 essays and in many other texts, starts from the same position, the impossibility of writing and the necessity to write. See, this double injunction. You heard it in Derrida's presentation. With Blanchot, you are posited in an impossibility from the start. You want to be his friend, but there are no friends. You want to write, but you cannot write. you have something to express, but you cannot express it, and so on. And this is, of course, a very good rejection of this model, which is so the kind of naive model that we know what we mean and we think about it. Oh, I'm going to write about the sun. Let me find the adequate words. And now I write about the sun. With Blanchot, and I take the sun perhaps not totally at random, because in the little narrative, the madness of the day, there's a meditation on the sun as such, on the day, what constitutes the day, as opposed to the night, and so on. For those of you who would be interested in Blanchot, what is extremely interesting is to compare the two versions of his first novel, Thomas the Obscure. That was an extremely long novel, and you can find it in France still. Let me stop this. Yes, and the Blanchot then decided to rewrite it in the 40s, and there was a moment when Blanchot, I would say, in the around 1948, published L'arrêt de mort, which is an untranslatable pun on death sentence. This is how it is translated into English. But l'arrêt de mort means in French, the stopping, the halting of death, stopping death. And it's a very strange text in which Blanchot goes back to the year 1938, before the Second World War, and talks about the death of a woman, and the narrator, who looks a little like Blanchot, in a way, allows her to live a few more days. Each time he comes, something happens, and she's afraid of him because she said he is death, but at the same time, he stops death. And then he's haunted by her, and somehow it's a ghost story, a very strange ghost story via other characters and so on. But he also wrote Le Très-Haut, the Most High, and Le Pas au-delà, 1949, and the first publication of The Madness of the Day that he reissued only later. And this is something that Blanchot would keep doing. He would take some of his older texts and republish them, and they look even stranger when they are republished. It was published originally in 1949, but I can say that the post-war years were extremely productive for Blanchot, and it was a moment when he has decided to somehow disappear. He had first gone to live in the south of France because he was quite sick, and I'm now going to share with you some of the work of, this is in the work of fire. Work of fire. This is I think you have.
Yes.
Yes. And in that book, I want to mention literature and the right to death. Again, one can say that here Blanchot is discussing Hegel. It was really but what I want to look at is close to the end. I want to give you here the text that Derrida was quoting. Now we are circling back in his first book on Husserl, show that, of course, Derrida was reading Blanchot very, very, page 323. And it's what
रूम
you,
बंद है पूरा पे फिर भी नेटवर्क आ जाए होता है
okay.
कहाँ सिग्नल मिलता है
Now,
Somebody,
could I please request you to mute yourself? You're not mute. Yeah.
so in this text, one can say that the first half of the text is a long meditation on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. I mentioned how important that text had been, both for Kojève, who had taught Blanchot, Bataille, Lacan, and many others how to read the text. And during the war, Jean Hippolyte, Derrida's mentor and friend, was retranslating the Phenomenology of Spirit, and soon after published a long text glossing it. And Blanchot was also reading this. And the key issue was what Hegel analyzes as the reign of terror. I want to insist on this because Kojève's reading of Hegel had been a Heideggerian and Marxist reading, focusing everything on the idea of the master and the slave, the fight to death, and the fact that the slave, in the end, announces the proletariat, you might say, if you are a Marxist. In the second reading that was produced a few years later only, with the help of Hippolyte and others, they understood that for Hegel, the key issue was his analysis of the French Revolution and the moment of the reign of terror. Of course, this question of terror had more relevance, I would say, in those dark years of the occupation, because you had in France a very strong communist party of the resistance, but also people who were aware of Stalinian terror and terror in, of course, the Nazi-occupied countries and so on. So terror meant something different. See, so in the text dating before the Phenomenology, Hegel, here, the friend and kindred spirit of Hölderlin, writes, so he's mentioning Hölderlin. We'll have to return a little bit to Hölderlin, this mad poet who was a close friend of Hegel, and they were together in the same Stift in Tübingen. So, see, Adam's first act, which made him master of the animals, was to give them names. That is, he analyzed them in their existence as existing creatures. And so you have, from a collection of essays titled System of 8034, Kojève, in his introduction to the reading of Hegel, interpreting a passage from the Phenomenology, demonstrates in a remarkable way how, for Hegel, comprehension was equivalent to murder. Then Blanchot adds, of course, my language does not kill anyone. And yet, when I say this woman, real death has been announced, and it is already present in my language. My language means that this person who is here right now can be detached from self, removed from existence and a present, suddenly plunged into nothingness in which there is no existence or presence. My language essentially signifies the possibility of this destruction. It is a constant, bold allusion to such an event. My language does not kill anyone, but if this woman were not really capable of dying, if she were not threatened by death at every moment of her life, bound and joined to death by an essential bond, I would not be able to carry out that ideal negation, the deferred assassination, which is what my language is. So you see, in a way, that Todorov had a point in saying that the main intuition of Derrida was given to him by Blanchot. Blanchot meditating on Hegel. What Roger Laporte adds to this is the slight minor point, yet very important, that Blanchot did not call this process writing. He still talks about say, when I say this woman. It was Derrida's genius to add something that apparently is not that different, but as you can see, it's not far from what Blanchot is saying here, because he's analyzing language like everyday language and following Hegel's idea that as soon as you use language, you discover this power, which is a power of negation and preservation at the same time, that Hegel calls Aufhebung. It is killing and preserving and then surviving. For Hegel, adding this notion that it is an idealization. You kill the materiality and you move to the spirit in a sort of simplistic Hegelianism. Derrida's genius was to reinterpret this analysis. Blanchot, clearly in me, the power to speak is also linked to my absence from being. I say my name and so on. You can see that Blanchot here, perhaps because he has been influenced by Levinas's phenomenology of the other, is still trying to posit it as the interaction between two people. You might say two subjects, two consciousness, or in Levinasian terms, two others, somehow, who interact via language. Derrida went further. See, everyday language called a cat, even if the living cat name were identical, goes on and on, develops this. And if one understands this, and I have to say, one has to move beyond a long passage that looks like a simple gloss of Hegel. And we know that, for instance, when the avant-garde magazine Tel Quel, I mentioned it a few times in connection with Derrida, was launched, they were wondering whether they would invite Blanchot to be a member of the committee. And the younger writers like Philippe Solers said, no, he's too Hegelian. Let's have Bataille rather than Blanchot. And so Bataille was considered as more, I would say, excessive and also perhaps somebody who had a sort of awareness of how to produce a review, since he had this excellent review critique I mentioned. But Blanchot was seen as too Hegelian. Here, of course, this is in Hegel, but this long meditation on the death of God, language and death, which is so recurrent in his writings, comes from a phenomenological meditation. Of course, for Blanchot, from this phenomenological analysis of death in language, he moves on to literature. Another point that is not lost for Derrida, the question of literature. And this is one of the central issues for Blanchot. I have to say that Blanchot has been totally misrepresented and misunderstood by important critics like Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson has a book on modernism in France and a very silly understanding of Blanchot. It is surprising in a way to see such a good critic who can do really wonderful things, at times completely missing the point. You think that because Blanchot is insisting on literature as literature, the experience of literature, Blanchot is a sort of formalist, forgetting completely that Blanchot from the start was a very political writer, first on the right, then on the left. And so it is a sort of tag that has been added to Blanchot. Blanchot, French formalism, modernism as formalism. I mean, this is why I would say Blanchot is not so often read today, let's say by my graduate students, because they think Blanchot, no, it's always the same question. It is true that in Blanchot, what you have is a sort of reiteration of the same. And this is what Derrida, if you remember, was saying. There's this speech that goes on. For Blanchot, it is speech. That speech is the verbal equivalent of what Levinas posited as the there is. The there is for Levinas was ontological or pre-ontological. And for Blanchot, that same experience is the experience of speech that goes on, speech that surrounds us, with a very Heideggerian view. Remember, whenever we walk through woods, in a wood, the trees, we work through the names of trees, we work through the language of trees, our language, and so on. But for Blanchot, it had the figure of a term that is impossible to translate into English, ressassement, le ressassement, meaning the rehashing, the rehearsing, the endless rehearsing of language. And this is how he then posits, see here, they have a footnote. In his book, Existent and Existent, Emmanuel Levinas uses the term il y a, there is, to throw some light on this anonymous and impersonal flow of being that precedes all being. And so for Blanchot, you could say that the neuter is that anonymous and impersonal flow of speech that precedes all language, that is already present in the heart of disappearance, in the depth of annihilation, still returns to language, being and the faculty of being, nothingness as existence. When there is nothing, there is being, a sort of pre-ontic. Here, I would be too long to oppose this chain of meditation, this chain of dialogues between Levinas, Bataille, and Blanchot, to what appears today as Sartre's total naivety when he talks about nothingness and when he uses Hegel in being and nothingness. It would be too long to show, but even if as I said, I admire being and nothingness for the amazing analyses, Sartre's theory of language is absolutely naive by comparison. And it simply comes from the fact that Sartre didn't read Hegel in the same way, or didn't read the same authors, at least didn't know Levinas and so on. Here again, you see, last point I want to make from this passage, that Blanchot meditates on Ponge before Derrida, indeed. Francis Ponge's tree is a tree that has observed Francis Ponge and that describes itself as it imagined Ponge might describe it. This is a great sentence. We describe very well how Ponge works on objects, water, pebbles, trees. He observes them, he describes. But as he says, when he describes something, it is the thing itself that describes itself. Perfectly said. I hope you remember what we saw with Ponge. Ponge intervenes in a sense that could look like fanciful anthropomorphic animation of things, but then you realize that it takes the point of view of the animal, the object, and so on. Remember what I was trying to suggest about the oyster that looks at you. An oyster looked at by Ponge becomes an oyster that looks at Ponge, and if you read the text, an oyster that looks at you, which is an amazing way of writing from the outside, to quote the tag of Foucault, Deleuze, and a few others. All this was already in Blanchot. So indeed, I would say that there is so much in Blanchot of the 40s that we can say that he was really an important influence on Derrida. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, the question of a certain, we say, pathos, I'll stop here, pathos of Blanchot with dread, anxiety, and so on, that perhaps feels a little bit dated today. And indeed, it's often read as a sort of hangover from existentialism. But this is why I wanted to, I want to share this. We are now looking at the famous text that is The Madness of the Day. You can see it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You have seen, I hope, the text Living On that Derrida devoted to the madness of the day. He returned to that text a lot. Derrida focuses on the beginning and the ending. And so, again, this is a text that was not called the madness of the day, but simply un récit, question mark. So a narrative, a tale, a story, all these correspond to récit. Published in 1949 in Empédocle, Empedocles in English, say, for the Greek philosopher. A very interesting, short-lived review launched by René Char, a great poet, and Albert Camus. I want to insist again on that constellation of names. You saw some of them connected with Blanchot's notion of friendship. Blanchot's notion of friendship was often idealized. That is, friendship didn't need that you would be, as Derrida said, together. You would just write to one another, send books, be given new ideas, new prompts, and that was his idea of friendship. So this is something that Beckett learned from Blanchot. I want to insist on this. And again, we talked about the proximity Derrida said he felt to Beckett, but we know that Beckett had read Blanchot very closely from the beginning, at least when he was during the war. He read all those essays, and he was hoping that Blanchot would write an essay on him, which he did quite later, but not immediately. And so he had the highest respect for Blanchot also as a commentator of Sade, but that's another topic. We could return to it if you want. I just quote the beginning and the ending to show you why Blanchot can be both fascinating, simplistic, and complicated, and endlessly tantalizing. It begins like this: I am not learned, I am not ignorant, I have known joys. This is saying too little. I am alive, and this life gives me the greatest pleasure. And what about death? When I die, perhaps any minute now, I will feel immense pleasure. I'm not talking about the foretaste of death, which is tale of undescribable. Suffering dulls the senses, but this is a remarkable truth, and I'm sure of it. I experience boundless pleasure in living, and I will take boundless satisfaction in dying. I have wandered, I've gone from place to place, stayed in one place, lived in a single room, and so on. And so you see a very abstract narrative, and the character who speaks has nevertheless a sort of trauma. I have loved people, I have lost them. I went mad when that blow struck me because it is hell. There was no witness and so on. So we realize that something has happened to him, and that perhaps he has been, somebody attacked him and poured acid on his eyes, on his face, or shot at him and he was blinded, or he became mad. And so it's sort of the diary of a madman who speaks, who has been totally traumatized. He has been in jail and in a hospital. And who are you, Tolstoy? We have here echoes of Dostoevsky. And when Blanchot was almost shot to death by this squad of actually Ukrainian soldiers in the Nazi corps of the SS, he mentioned Dostoevsky, who, as you may know, famously, as a young man, had been caught by the Tsar and was sent for his execution, but it was a mock execution, so they shot a blank, or they didn't shoot, I forget the detail, but Dostoevsky thought that he was going to be killed, and then he survived, which was a fundamental experience, maybe, of his life. In the same way, for Blanchot, this kind of being granted a second life, that he thought his life had ended. Who threw glass in your face? That's a question that keeps reappearing. And so this is then why he cannot really see. This is how the text ends. Of course, neither of them were the chief of police, but because there were two of them, there were three. This third remained fairly convinced, I am sure, that the writer A man who speaks and who reasons with distinction is always capable of recounting the fact that he remembers. A story, so un récit, no stories, never again. One can take this text as Blanchot's farewell to a certain mode of narrative, and Derrida uses it. If you read Living On, it's a text that I cannot gloss because it's so proliferating, and he starts using that technique of quoting a lot, adding his commentary. Derrida sees a certain figure that he called the double invagination. So you have a sort of loop like this that will be defined by the first sentence with its contradiction. Je ne suis pas savant, je ne suis pas ignorant. I am not knowledgeable. I'm not devoid of knowledge. So already a contradiction. And at the end, somebody with a novelist should be able to tell the story. No more stories, and so on. And so Derrida retraces this complicated movement by imagining kind of looping of two circles. I have it here if you want. I'll just show it to you here. You see this weird figure with an eye in the middle. It would be too long to discuss here, but from a Derridian Lacanian perspective, I would say that what Derrida is describing here is Blanchot's Borromean knot, if you know a little bit what Lacan means by this. That is a knot that can be untied, and a knot in which subjectivity is caught in the middle and at the same time decentered and nowhere. At the same time, what he shows is that this knot is, as he says, that Derrida keeps saying, there is no boundary, no limit to the text. Therefore, the text cannot end. So you have the upper border, but this is already a paradoxical border, the lower border, but fundamentally, what he talks about is about the paradoxes of vision. And here, I'll say simply that it's quite obvious that at the same time Blanchot was writing this, he was writing. So with Blanchot, one thing that is interesting is to see the links between the creative fiction text that he writes, and he wrote all his life, and the essays, since he wrote so many. And they generally highlight one another. And I would say that at that time, as had been observed by Holland and a few others, Leslie Hill, Blanchot was returning to an author he had discussed quite at some length, Paul Valéry. Paul Valéry, who had invented, I'll write the name here, Monsieur Test. And it was a text that Blanchot admired. Derrida commented it quite often in his discussions of bêtise, because it begins, and there's you can find it on YouTube, Derrida talking about stupidity and bêtise, and commenting the beginning of this text in French, very hard to translate. La bêtise n'est pas mon fort. I am not very strong on stupidity. As Derrida says, it's very stupid to say that, but that's a paradox Valéry was aware of. And in Monsieur Test, there is an addendum to Monsieur Test's French text. Okay, French text, Monsieur Test says, what I see blinds me. And this is more or less word for word what you find in the middle of the text of Blanchot. This paradox that what you see, and it is a meditation, we might say, that is Hegelian. Hegel also talks about the day, that if you look at this, you need the sun, you need light to see, but if you look at the sun, you can be blinded. And another series of texts that, and you saw a reference to him in passing, was a meditation on Hölderlin. Hölderlin, who was not only Hegel's friend, but also one of the best poets in the German language, and who very early showed signs of derangement, psychosis, asked to be taken. He didn't want to go to a hospital, but lived with in very simple circumstances, sort of the long moment of the madness of the later years, still writing amazing poems, many of which are lost, but the few that have been collected, and there's a great translation by my friend Richard Seaworth, Hymns and Fragments are absolutely magnificent, really fantastic poetry. And these are poems that Hölderlin would just memorize and recite to friends who would visit, and then they would at times take notes and write them down and so on. So the mad poet, we'll see in Derrida's sort of fiction of Hegel in Glas that Hölderlin and Hegel's sister are part of this weird plot that he invents with Jean Genet. They belong to the same world of madness, the night, and the day, the clarity of the day. Since for Hölderlin, who was a very good Hellenist, what Hölderlin invented, I would say, not so many people know about this thing, some do, but it is important to know that Hölderlin had invented what struck Nietzsche when Nietzsche wrote his first book, The Origin of Tragedy, which was that the Greeks had a sort of tension within them, the tension between what Nietzsche called Apollo and Dionysius. For Nietzsche, who has read Schopenhauer, it is the idea of representation, the day, we could say, the light of the day, or for Valéry, noon, the light when there's no shadow, and there is the night. Night is Dionysius, the darkness, the frenzy, sexuality, orgies, blood rites, and so on. Dionysius, revelries, excess, battalion, excess, and so on. Hölderlin had already anticipated this in his remarks on Sophocles, Antigone, and so on. Imagine that the Greeks were already, the classical Greeks were people who came from the north, were blonde barbarians, maybe coming from India, and not at all Southerners, and that they were like antipodal interactions in their thinking. So just a note in passing that Hölderlin is a very important, but of course for Heidegger, it goes without saying, Heidegger, we know this, somehow managed to take distances from his Nazi, I would say, infatuation by rereading Hölderlin and by meditating on Hölderlin, who had been taken his strange fate because of a few poems, hymns to the Rhine, so on, as a nationalist poet by the Nazis. And rereading Hölderlin in the late 30s, Heidegger realizes that it's not exactly like that. So the last text I would want to share here is Leslie Hill, who, sorry, not deconstruction and criticism, Leslie Hill on Blanchot. So because I want to just give you a sort of sense of, it's from a collection I edited. You can see it? Yes, I hope you're seeing it. Yeah. So
Hi.
this, yes, you see it.
Yeah.
Good, great. So I just took a few passages from a writer I like a lot. I admire Leslie Hill in England. It was written so well about Derrida and about Blanchot and also about Beckett, and has written for that my collection on Beckett and Derrida, Beckett, and Blanchot. And he insists on this paradox that as a Blanchotian allegory, as it were, the proximity of Derrida and Beckett was marked by precisely silence. Whereas with Blanchot, there is a huge production of Derrida. And in Parage, so here you will see, at least I think it may be easier for you to see it written, Thomas the Obscure, L'Arrêt de mort des saints de la folie du jour. The fictions Derrida pointed out remained inaccessible to me, as if they were enveloped in a thick mist, with only fascinating reflection ever managing to reach me, and only on occasion, at irregular intervals, the light of a beacon invisible from the coast. I will not say from now on he hastened to add these fictions fully emerged from the discretion. On the contrary, but in their dissimulation itself, in the distance of the inaccessible as such, because in giving it names, they open onto it, they introduce themselves to me once more. I think it is important when facing Blanchot to consider this. And I have to say, I have worked on a few texts of Blanchot for collections. I participated in a collection, Understanding Blanchot, Understanding Modernism, and I wrote about one single novel, but it took me like a whole year to penetrate that novel, and again, knowing that I should not penetrate it too much via biographical readings, let's say. And to give you just a sense of what Blanchot is doing, his first novel that contains everything, Thomas the Obscure, the idea of the obscure, the darkness, like Hardy Jude the Obscure, of course, not far, begins when you have the main hero, Thomas, who decides to take a swim at night. And it's a fantastic moment when Thomas almost drowns. He keeps on swimming. He doesn't see anything. And you don't know where you are when you read that text. It's extraordinary. So this is what Blanchot was doing. He invented a certain style of writing. And indeed, for Blanchot, and this is perhaps, if I had to insert my slightly negative note, the only negative note I would say about Blanchot is that at times he sounds too much like a French Kafka. And that's indeed what he wrote very well about Kafka. But he wanted to retranslate, rethink, reshape the best of Kafka as he read him in French. We are going to be moving on to Glas. As Derrida explained in Glas and elsewhere, the underlying logic is the same as that which governs signatures. Any signature, whether handwritten or mechanical, analog or digital, can testify to the unique presence, authority, or responsibility of its author, only because it can continue to be what it is in the absence of the author. I want to insist on this because we may have forgotten, and I have this problem every day when I write recommendation letters, and I do write a lot. And there's always this hesitation these days. Do you accept an electronic signature or not? And so we know now with our computers, we have fonts that imitate handwriting. And they haven't found yet, of course, you can have your own signature as reproduced. But in many cases, we end up printing a text and signing it by hand with any kind of pen, then scanning it and sending it, and assuming that the person will be in China or in India, we see the difference between my handwriting and the machine that would imitate my handwriting. And we know that in so many cases, there is still this myth in that the presence, the ownership, the unique subject who is behind. But indeed, if not, it could be somebody imitating your signature and stealing all your money from your account, which happens, as we know. So all this, the possibility of dispossession, falsification, theft, or fraud also comes with a question of iterability. And generally, you need to know something like in the US, what you will never divulge is your social security number. Only you will know, and so on. But as we know, these are very thin veils covering a lack of singularity. So Leslie Hill mentioned this, that Blanchot said in 1947, let us accept that literature begins at the moment when literature becomes a question. And I want to add that element of interrogation to literature, because indeed, as I said earlier, when Frederick Jameson, for instance, believes that Blanchot is somebody who is caught in a sort of tautology, literature is literature, and that's it. And everything that is not literature is unimportant. And we are in a sort of ideology of aesthetic autonomy. The work of art exists and abolishes all the rest, which would be a naive translation of what Mallarmé said at some point. At the same time, once the page is written, the question that kept posing itself to the writer while writing it, perhaps without even with realizing it, is now present on the page, now the heart of the work, awaiting the approach of a reader. There lies the same question addressed to language behind whoever is writing and reading. By language now become literature. And of course, as I suggested earlier, for Derrida, it is the question of writing that is interjected here. So this is, of course, what you have in Beckett with the unnameable. For Blanchot, the realization, the main realization is that even when a poet or a writer writes in a single language, and Mallarmé is a good example, and Mallarmé knew some English, he knew some German, his wife was German, he could read Hegel in German, he could translate, and he did translate many texts from the English, but he wrote in French. However, his French, which is so strong, is by necessity a little bit foreign. Proust, in the same way, I think I quoted that famous sentence, said, any beautiful book is written, as it were, in a foreign language. Or, to put it differently, when you discover a great book, you realize that it changes your language, and your language will be a little antiquated. You will have to have your language come up to the level of what you have written. I feel this once in a while when I discover a great new novel or a great new poem. Oh, in my own language, which is French. I say, oh, my language will have to come up to the level of what I've read. And oh, I don't even know French anymore. I don't know English anymore. I think, of course, this is the effect that great writers have in general. Joyce did it with Finnegan's Wake by changing English, but you don't have to change your own language to reach that effect. So I'll stop here on Blanchot. There would be a lot more to say, and Derrida has this entire book called Parage. That's a long meditation on Blanchot. Of course, I realize that it can be a little complicated for you to read Derrida writing about a text you haven't read. And but I would say, if only at the end of the seminar you decide to open a few novels of Blanchot, you will have progressed a lot, because if you read them and think about them, you will learn a lot. So now I want to leave a little time for questions. If you have any question, that is to say, if not, we'll have a break soon.
Feel free to type out your questions, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can always speak too.
I think you have all the text you need in front of my, yes.
Yeah. So there's one.
That's that's a good question. Was Sixou influenced by Blanchot when she decided to call her novels as fiction? Yes. Hélène Sixou read Blanchot very, very closely, and I would say yes. It's what the difference between. So of course it depends whether fiction is in French fiction, whereas what Blanchot is suggesting is récit. See, so récit, no more. That is narrative. I don't know whether you recognized where Blanchot's like final sentence came from. Let me just say it. Kafka famously had this little remark: no more psychology ever. And this is more or less the same thing. No more psychology, no more narrative. There is no more narrative in the sense of, and this is why this text is very much a gloss on Valéry, because Valéry himself, who was a poet and wrote a lot, but never any novel, as far as I know, unless there is one hidden somewhere, made fun of people who can begin a story with, in French, la marquise sortit à 5 heures. The marquis went out at 5 o'clock, at 5 p.m. This for Valéry is a little ridiculous, a little narrative with a story and so on. That for him was bad, was boring. In a sense, Valéry was not a surrealist at all, but contemporary, shared with André Breton a dislike for a simple story told in descriptive style. You may know André Breton's attack on Dostoevsky, so unfair with description and so on. This for Breton was a waste of time. We don't want to read those stories with a character, a narrator, the description of the room. We've done it, enough of that, and so on. So no more narrative. Does it mean that then Blanchot wrote fiction? Perhaps. I will leave it to you. Hélène Sixou, yes. For Blanchot, what is generated was what you find in a number of texts, and the one that is the most easy to find in English is the writing of the disaster, which is really important. The writing of the disaster is a mixture of short fragments. You saw a few that Derrida pointed out in that little video. Some are totally fictional, you might say. Some are like vignettes, autobiographical vignettes. Others are meditations on writing and so on. So a complete medley of styles and tones, not a unified narrative going from one beginning of the story to the ending of the story. There is, I didn't understand the claim that no language is identical with itself. with respect to Beckett. Yes, that's a good point. You know, Beckett is a complex case because, as we know, and of course, this posed a real problem for people who do not know French. The question is this: can one become a Beckett specialist without knowing French? I would say no, you cannot. Can one be a Beckett specialist without knowing English? I would say no, you cannot. That's a paradox, as simply put as I can. Why? Because Beckett, if we follow his itinerary, we know started writing in English. Strange noise. Okay. Started writing in English, then abandoned English, wrote in French, then returned to English, and during the time of the most intense production, just after the trilogy and the first plays, would immediately translate into English what he had written in French, like the trilogy and so on. But as most commentators of Beckett have observed, there are at times huge differences, even in Godot, between the French and the English text. Both are authorized by Beckett. This is why so much has been written about Beckett and auto-translation, self-translation. So what you can see here is a simple example that in order to understand Beckett's English, you need to know Beckett's French, and in order to understand Beckett's French, you need to know Beckett's English. This is true, I would say, of all great writing, and Derrida keeps traces of this when he inserts in his text words in other languages, German, Greek, Latin, and so on, to show to you that language works like that. Or Heidegger, for that matter, Heidegger is always punning on Greek, Sanskrit etymologies that are contained in words. Does it give you access to a truer meaning? Heidegger perhaps believed that. I don't think we believe this today, that, let's say, because the word to be in English has a root in Sanskrit, meaning to stand upright. When you stand, yes or no. It's up to us to change the meanings. Yeah, could you also please talk about Beckett's trilogy and his attitude towards language? Yes, that's, I mean, it would take a very, very, very long time. And I will mention Molloy in Derrida's text in Glas. Derrida includes a passage from Molloy, as you may have seen if you had time to read Glas. The trilogy, as you know, begins with Molloy. Molloy is a double novel, 2 parts. First part about Molloy, who has a certain trajectory to meet his mother, and second, Moran, who is trying to find Molloy and cannot find Molloy, but becomes like Molloy and returns home and loses his son in between. And then you have Malone Dies, in which at the end, the death of the main character narrator is there, is, I would say, exemplified. You find the death on the page. And finally, this extraordinary text, the unnameable, and of course, it is the unnameable that would be the Derridian text. Why? Because precisely the narrator is not even called the unnameable. You cannot say he is unnameable. There is something that is unnameable, and the narrator keeps on letting words pour from his mouth and so on. But say, I don't have a mouth. He's blind. He can see. He has no ears. He has ears. He does not have a body. He has to invent alter egos, as you may know. And in the end, it is sort of, I can go on, I will go on, I can go on, and so on, and the endless ressassement of language. But what you have in the unnameable that was written in French, the very interesting French, very funny French, that time very earthy, very bawdy, is that narrator saying, this is a language that does not belong to me. I will use it, but it is not my language. I don't know any language, and so on. So this is where Derrida comes from as well. Of course, I mean, this would be a huge, huge, huge question, and we could have, and I think Arka could help you because he knows Beckett very well, help you with this. Durgesh, as you mentioned, that a great novel changes the language. Think God of the Small Things and Midnight Children of that category. I agree. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I read those two novels and I love them. Might not say that God of the Small Things has changed the language. I would say Midnight Children, yes, perhaps more. Why? Because Midnight Children, I think, manage to make what had been a typically South American production, the novel of magical realism that had been produced by Alejo Carpenter, Marquez, and a few others, something that was so obviously Indian English. And that changed the language indeed. But I would say that if we refine a little bit the analysis, I'm, for instance, interested in the fact that Annie Ernaux, I don't know whether you have followed that French, very interesting woman writer, has got the Nobel Prize for Literature. And of course, we know that people who give the Nobel Prize read in translation, and they are generally Swedish. And so they may know French or English and so on, but and a writer like Annie Ernaux, what is very interesting for me, and I read just a few of her novels and so on, it's really very interesting and beautiful. It's very simple, very direct, very without any frills, and this is something that Beckett had. That I have worked on this when a few times Beckett had younger would-be writers who would send him texts, and Beckett was trying to help them. He would say, and I like that term. It's hard to translate into English. Sans fioriture. Meaning without frills, be direct, be simple. Which doesn't mean at the same time express the idea you have in your mind, not at all. Okay, question. Can you expand a little on Blanchot and his proximity to psychoanalysis? Yes, I mean, this is what you find in the writing of The Disaster, mostly. And there are other echoes, at least. We know that Blanchot had read Freud. He mentions Freud quite a lot. I don't think he ever had a psychoanalysis himself, but his friend Bataille had the experience of psychoanalysis. And so, and as always with Blanchot, we can start from the few texts. So if you know the writing of The Disaster, you will see what I mean. It is, you have a sort of primal scene that is described 3 times in the text, and Blanchot keeps returning to a sort of ecstatic moment when he's a child of panic, anxiety, fear, and so on. At the same time, if we see Blanchot in that triangulation in which you have Bataille and Lévinas, what do they contribute to him and to his understanding of psychoanalysis? Lévinas, the questioning or the positioning of the other, the big other, because it was Lévinas, as we have seen, I hope, who very early from the 40s, before Lacan, was talking about the other, uses the other in a sense that is a non-dialectics of the big other, le grand autre. And so that's a central concern. With Bataille, there is something that is a transformation of classical Freudianism into Lacan, because Bataille is always meditating on, and Blanchot knew this quite well, on excretion, on rejection, on abjection, on what resists excrement, you might say, or the Freudian logic of the gift that is shit, in fact, and but symbolic chain that Freud talks about, the little girl giving a child to the father, all these exchanges that constitute the Oedipal structure. This for Bataille was something accepted, but as we've seen, he tries to find an excess. This excess is what he called the accursed share, la part maudite, and of course, this is what gave Lacan the idea of jouissance, something that is beyond pleasure and pain, and excess, and perhaps death together. So this triangulation shows that for Blanchot, psychoanalysis is not just a practice he could or could not have accepted to undergo himself, but the source of constant meditation is the author, the writer, psychoanalyzing himself. What is the role of writing in Freud, and so on. Yes. Okay, if there are no more questions, we can have a little pause, and then we'll move on to Derrida's GLA.
Yeah.
5 minutes. Okay.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so
Perfect.
much.
Perfect.
In the meantime, I think now everybody is accustomed to this. Could I request everyone to switch on their video for once so that I can take a screenshot? This is the last time we're going to do this, so your travails are at an end. Okay. Thank you. Some more faces, please. Okay, just give me a second. Okay, one more. Yeah, I think Dheeraj might be trying to get back in, so I'll just give it one more minute. There might be some problem at his end. Anyway, I think we've got most of you there. Thank you so much. We can take a bio break and we'll be back in like 2-3 minutes. Okay. Hi, Jean-Michel. Okay, shall we
Uh,
restart it?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, okay.
Great.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so we are now, so this is the last thing I want to study with you, because I first want to mention that there is a new translation that I will show you, very recent, of Derrida Glas, Klang. And so you can see, interestingly, that you have the French book that I have here. So it's the cover of the French book, the original 1974 edition. And it is there. So Jacques Derrida Glas, and rewritten with, so translated by David Wills and Jeffrey Bennington, handwriting, which I think is an interesting idea. University of Minnesota Press, and also the back erases the original layout, and it is a text that was published in 2021. And as they say, and I'll mention it, so they go back to that text that you have now. I hope you had time to read some of it. The first English translation by John P. Levy and Richard Rand, which is excellent. And that said, it is excellent. And I don't think they have found any mistake from 1986. And I can say that we can use it without any loss happily. And I thought I would give you a number of, let's say, comparative passages, but once I look at them, I thought there were differences, but they are not so crucial, so important. I would say that for me, Glas is perhaps one of Derrida's best books, or perhaps his masterpiece. And I can say that I discovered this not so much when it was just published. I bought it and I was really surprised, like everybody else. What is this weird text in which you have 2 columns and so many quotes and so on? So a little hard to find one's way in it. It creates a sort of double maze because it's absolutely non-linear. And we can say that, of course, it is a book on Hegel and a book on Genet put together. But even describing it like that doesn't render justice to it. I discovered that quite some time ago when I taught a class on Hegel, a graduate class on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and then I assigned Glas, and I could see how good Derrida was facing the Phenomenology of Spirit. One text that was not translated in so let me share with you in the first version, and I don't know why they didn't do this. I need to just find how to share my screen. Okay, is this text, which was the presentation of you can find it in Glossary, a sort of gloss published later, but it's in Klang, so the more recent Klang. They see, this is the insert in most, and perhaps say all, of the books by Derrida, and also many by Hélène Cixous, published at the Edition Galilée. Okay, Galilée already contains Glas, Galilée, Glas. there would be a little page called here insert, folded generally, presenting the book. And when you would open the book, you would have that. And because some of these books, not all, where in fact the pages were bound, and you would have to cut the pages. And so you would, before you could open the book, you would see what it was about. So this is written by Derrida, and this is a presentation that he added to his own book. And so you can see first two columns, truncated at top and bottom, and carved out in their flanks, incisions, tattoos, incrustations. So the two columns correspond to the aspect of the page, and somebody is not muted. I can, yes, try noise. And so, as he says, truncated at top and bottom, meaning that indeed, if you look at the way the French ends, which is reproduced in the two translations, it looks like it could continue. It stops very carefully at the end of the page, and in les débris, le débris de, it ends with de, of, as if the text wasn't finished. I'm sure that some people say, oh, my copy is faulty, pages are missing, and so on. And this is the kind of technique that we both have with Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, at the end of Finnegan's Wake, along the, and then you go back to the beginning, river run, and also famously for Blanchot, who, as I mentioned, wrote a lot on Kafka, and the fact that so many of Kafka's texts are unfinished. Kafka just stopped, or we lost the last page, and like one of the most exciting texts of Kafka, the Der Bau, the Burrow, either the last page is missing, but it ends in the middle of a sentence. So, as he adds, the first reading could act as though two texts standing one against the other or one without the other did not communicate with each other. And in a certain deliberate way, that remains true as to pretext, object, language, style, and rhythm. A dialectic on the one hand, a galactics on the other. Dialectics, of course, Hegel, galactic, Genet. Between the two, the clapper of another text, one might say, of another logic, nickname obsequence, penetrate, stricture, lock, anteraction, bit, and so on. And here you see Derrida inventing all those weird terms like anteraction. I return to that term. And so this text is indeed rich in coinings that Derrida would produce for a while. And then one can note that indeed in his practice as a writer, he stopped doing this, inventing even difference, if you want, adds an A on purpose and so on, and return to, I would say, syntactical plays, but not transforming the semantimes, the words themselves. For whomever is attached to the signature, to the corpus, to what is proper, let us declare that putting my name, my body, my signet into play, mon sein in French, the sein, signet, that's how they translate, signature, but the machine that makes you capable of signing. In one of the same blow, I elaborate literally those of a certain Hegel in one column, those of a certain Genet in the other. And indeed, the signature Hegel, for instance, and this infuriated classical philosophers, especially French philosophers, hated that text. I saw many of them who, oh, yeah, you like it because you're not a philosopher, but it is impossible. One of the things that irked them most was that Derrida puns on the name of Hegel. Hegel if you pronounce, some people in French pronounce it aigle, 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 aigle. And so Joyce at times transformed Hegel into aigle, the eagle. And for philosophers, this is, no, you cannot do that. And then, of course, he noticed that Hegel, in his own letters, would often sign HGL, abbreviating his name on HDL. And so he found this GL matrix somehow of signifiers everywhere. For Genet, and we return to it, Genet himself, who was an abandoned child, he knew that his mother was called Genet. He never knew his father, and somehow Genet in French, which means broom, Genet is flower, wildflower, was a signifier Genet somehow played a lot with. Why? Because if we, if you can easily rewrite Genet, the name of the flower, as Je nais, I am being born. And so this is indeed something that Genet is aware of, that his very name contains a statement, I am being born, I give birth to myself, and so on. Of course, as he says, there is the thing rises in detail, detaches itself, turning in two towers, the incessant acceleration of a turn by turn in the double solitude, the color side, so Genet and Hegel, because basically what one can say, and this is what makes this text really so full of insights, that they try to take into account the entire corpus of Hegel, the entire corpus of Genet. So there is a lot of condensation here, even though you have long quotes. But basically, Derrida, who taught many, many classes on Hegel at the École Normale Supérieure, I went to a few of them when I was in Paris, very detailed for aggregation students who had to work with the German text and really go to all the details of what each concept would mean and so on. So he had done all that preparatory work. For Genet, Genet's collected works are quite substantial in Gallimard. Genet published novels, but became famous a little like Beckett with his plays. And he did one film, and at the end of his life published two very important books that are very political. I worked on them, and actually in connection with Derrida a long time ago in 1993 with a friend, a French friend, Patrice Bougon, who was at the University of Pennsylvania at that time. We organized a conference on Genet at University of Pennsylvania. And then when we were both back in France in the summer of 1993, we invited Derrida to present on Genet and the Palestinians. And then we realized that Derrida agreed with the politics of Genet, who had just died. The last book that he did was published posthumously, Genet Nu, called A Captif Amoureux, a Prisoner of Love. That document, I don't know whether you have had a look at it, very well translated into English, I have to say, that documents the last years of Genet's life when he went to accompany Palestinian militants in the West Bank, and who were at that time fighting against Israel and so on. So it's really interesting book. And The Declared Enemy, a collection of essays, also very political. And interestingly, Derrida agreed with Genet. So we'll return to this, but there was a deep friendship between Genet and Derrida at the end of Genet's life. So the fact that in 1974, he put them together makes each side a gloss on the other side. Each column here figures a colossus, kolossos in Greek, the name given to the determinant double to his erection substitute. And we were talking about psychoanalysis. We can say that Derrida has a psychoanalytic approach to both Hegel and Genet, and that fundamentally is really interested in the remarks on sexuality, erection, castration, blood, and so on. Genet is a very explicit writer in terms of sexuality. Hegel, not so much, but Derrida manages to find all the little passages having to do with sexuality, sexual difference, and there are quite a few in Hegel's abundant oeuvre. And so here you have this idea of the signifier. It's in 74, I would say, the culmination of a sort of utopia that Derrida, I think, abandoned after Glas. And Glas both embodies it and shows that it cannot go beyond certain limits, the utopia of an analysis of text purely via the signifier. And in this case, the signifier is Glas, Glas. Glas, and so the funny thing is that in English, the two translations are glass or clang. Clang is a term that is used a lot. I'll return to it by Hegel, meaning sound. But in French, glas means death knell, tolling the bell for the dead. There is also, we'll see this in passing, a poem by Bataille called Glas. So, here, see this Glas, the signifier, acoustic and graphic, musical and rhythmic, choreography of Glas in his letter, and polyglottic fecundation. But this opposition, signified, signifier, moreover, like all oppositions, in particular sexual opposition, is by regular chance compromise, each term divided into agglutinating with the other, a gl effect, glue, birdlime, spit, sperm, ball, unguent, forms the identityless conglomerate of this ceremonial. It replaced mimesis and the arbitrariness of the signature in a wild coupling, fake, signet, milk, drunk like a bell ringer hanging from his robe. This is an image taken from Genet about a friend of his who died, who was a rope dancer. What remains of absolute knowledge? This is the Hegelian question posed by Derrida. And absolute knowledge, one needs to know this, one of the complications of the text, is written in French as savoir absolu, abbreviated in SA. And so throughout the text, you have Derrida talking about sa, 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 SA. But in French, sa can also be the possessive in the feminine, sa femme, and so on. What remains of absolute knowledge? It is indeed the question of Hegel. It is the question that had been posed by Kojève. It is a question posed by Heidegger to Hegel. Did he really believe in absolute knowledge? Did Hegel believe that at the end of history, there would be absolute knowledge? Did he believe, as some would say, that absolute knowledge would coincide with the emergence of Hegel as the professor of philosophy in Berlin? Or is it just a fiction, just a myth that Hegel had? We can return to that question. This is a question that Derrida keeps posing there. What remains of absolute knowledge, of history, of philosophy, of political economy, of psychoanalysis, of semiotics, of linguistics, of poetics, of labor, of language, of sexuality, the family, of religion, the state, etc.? What remains to be detailed of the remainder? Why this question in the form of colossi and phallic flowers? Why exalt in thanatopraxis? What the enjoyment in celebrating me here, now, at a given time, baptism of circumcision, marriage or death, father or mother, Hegel's father, Genet's mother? Remains to know what has failed to be thought, the detail cut in a coup. Coup is the stroke, but a cut as well. The famous line, of Apollinaire at the end of his poem, Zone. Apollinaire describes the setting sun as soleil coupé, sun cut head. This is then the new preface. You can find that on the web if you're interested. I'll just go through it quickly to show why they felt they needed to retranslate. The Genet column of Clam was born from a conjunction of professional and personal interest that recounted the biographies on one and the other writer, Edmund White, on the one side. I have to say that in our conference on Genet in 1993, we invited Edmund White, who is a very good writer, who had written this beautiful biography of Jean Genet. It's quite exciting to hear him. And Benoit Peters, who has written the best biography of Derrida. It began with Derrida's 1965 tel quel article on Artaud, La Parole Soufflée, it should be with an E here, which attracted the attention of a mutual acquaintance, Paul Thévenin, who hosted a dinner where Genet and Derrida met and immediately formed a close friendship. And I'll return to it via a text by a friend who analyzes how in Derrida's work with Genet, there is somehow Jean-Paul Sartre in the background. Sartre had written famously a long book on Genet, Saint Genet, Actor and Martyr. Sartre was using the fact that Genet was the name of a famous medieval, a Roman comedian, a real actor who became a Christian and was killed, and then there was a play about him and so on, and wrote this enormous book on Genet that functioned as a sort of block, a writer's block for Genet. After that book was published, for a few years, he couldn't write at all. The friendship between Derrida and Genet flourished over a period of about 5 years. Notable manifestations, a series of tête-à-tête in the uncanny calm and agitation of May 1968 Paris. Derrida's support of Genet's activism in favor of Angela Davis and Soledad Brothers, and the touching letter contributed by Genet to an issue of Les Lettres Françaises devoted to Derrida's work in March 1972, in which he compares the philosopher's writing to that of Proust and advises a slow reading that accepts what is offered to us with good grace, namely poetry. Then sense will be proffered in recompense, very simply as in a garden. They were still in contact following Derrida's brief incarceration in Prague in 1982, with Genet wanting to know precisely whether Derrida had recognized the odor of that other garden, the prison, because it was indeed the only moment when Derrida was jailed on Trump's charges of having carried drugs through Czechoslovakia, whereas in fact he was meeting subversive elements in 1982, just before the opening of the Soviet bloc. And so Genet, who had been in jail many times, will return to it, who wanted to know how it felt for Derrida, who had been quite scared by the experience, because at some point he thought that he was going to be stuck in jail in Czechoslovakia. Why Czechoslovakia? Because his wife was from Czech origin. Genet's response to Klein in 1974 was friendly, is muted. The book's right-hand column was mostly composed in the summer of 1973, written at a feverish pace on the portable Olivetti typewriter. Derrida had earlier begun writing a double-column work on Condillac, which had been inspired, not perhaps, we know it had been inspired by Genet's What Remains of a Rembrandt, a text that had appeared in Tel Quel in 1967. We should remember that Derrida flirted more than once, which had manufactured formal intervention during the same period. For instance, in the double session of 1970, one of whose most explicit subjects was Mallarmé, obsession with white, blank, and black spacings, especially the latter's Un coup de dé, or the twin columns of tympan that Derrida wrote in 1972 at the preface to Margin of Philosophy, which I think in Derrida's work is the first time he uses a double column. In other cases, as you may have seen with Living On, Derrida uses the fact that you can have a very long footnote, the text and the footnote, at times the footnote larger than the text, or again, since I mentioned circumfession, you have Jack Bennington's text on him, and then a series of footnotes under the text. Derrida played a lot with all those typographic arrangements. Countless hours of artisanal manual cutting, pasting, and typesetting were required to produce the marriage of dialectics and galactics, or the treatise on organology that the book engineers. It appeared with Edition Galilée in September 1974. The stakes of the experiment were very high for Derrida, who recognized the book's scandalous or obscene provocation, but also saw it as reviving an old tradition of embedding text within commentary unfettered by current academic norms, providing another space, another practice of reading, writing, of exegesis. I would like to say that this is a sort of medieval practice of writing. As you may know, for many centuries in Europe, at least in the Europe that was Christian, and in which people were, let's say, knowledge, what we would call today academic knowledge, was restricted to convents and places before the invention of the first universities, with, say, La Sorbonne, Salamanca, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, and so on. There was a practice that was that of the commentary. As you may know, what was called an author came from the root in Latin of auctor. The author was the person who was allowed to add. Auctor means to add. And adding to what? To a text that was written in the middle of the page and was surrounded by marginal comments. At times 4, could have one on top, 2 on each side, 1 at the bottom, and then new interpolations would be added when, for instance, the medieval monks were beginning to understand the Bible as a text that can be glossed, or when Aristotle began being translated, or Plato, and so on. You had that practice. That was at times anonymous, at times not anonymous, at times you would know who had added a commentary, and so on. So Derrida is going back to a very old tradition of this kind of embedding text within. In some passage, there's one passage in which he has something on how to produce an organ in ancient German font that he reproduces as such. At first sight, the exuberance of the Genet column with its proliferating neologisms and his bold claims that have been that I've seen of most, if not the archaeologists, philosophers, hermeneutes, semioticians, semanticians, psychoanalysts, rhetoricians, poeticians, perhaps even all those readers who believe in literature or anything at all, to quote the text, stand in quite stark contrast to the manifest pedagogical patience of the Hegel column, with its careful exposition of a number of difficult moments in Hegel's thought, gathered around the motif of the family. Indeed, the basis for that column is provided by a seminar first taught at the École Normale Supérieure in 1971-72 under the title La Famille de Hegel, which explicitly presents itself as an introduction to Hegel. And indeed, I mentioned that already. If one read that text well, and of course you could just take it and not pay attention to the Genet side, you have an extraordinary book on Hegel written by Derrida. The first 125 pages of Hegel column correspond quite closely to the 14 type lesson of the seminar. the session division of which can sometimes do not systematically be detected in Klang itself. So what they did in Klang that they felt was closer to the original manuscript was to reproduce those intervals better. Although every sentence of the seminar text had been somewhat edited or rewritten for Klang, not to an unusual extent for Derrida's text based on seminar material, some quite substantial additions have been made, most obviously by the development of Pleroma, John of the Baptist, lengthy inserted quotation from Hegel's correspondence. The text follows quite recognizably the general shape of the seminar, which ends its 14th and final session on the question of the prohibition of incest. One can say, and I'll just say this, that it is a psychoanalytic reading of Hegel. And how the question here is absolutely crucial for philosophy. As you may know, one can say that it is Hegel who is the first thinker of sexual difference. This is explicitly stated in a number of texts, mostly in the Phenomenology of Spirit. This culminates in Hegel's inspired, if biased, reading of Antigone as a key moment for him in what Hegel calls morality or Sittlichkeit. And this is one of the texts that Derrida illuminates. And I have to say, having recently taught a class on Antigone to a few students, we went back to Derrida's pages. They are absolutely illuminating. And then the final 70 odd pages of Klein introduced, including discussion, Feuerbach, Marx, long excerpts on fetishism, the reconstruction of the passage in Hegel from religion to philosophy, do not correspond to anything in La Famille de Hegel, but they come from other lectures that Derrida had given at the École Normale Supérieure, Religion et Philosophie, Berlin, 1973, and so on. So all this show that Derrida had worked for a long time on Hegel, and he gives you passages from his seminars on Hegel, and it is not indeed a critique of Hegel. As I say, there is this decision to work on Aufhebung, the term I've already used, sublation, to understand what it really means, and on the question of difference in Hegelian dialectics, culminating into absolute knowing, which is how Hegel presents the evolution of the phenomenology of spirit. At the end, stage by stage, one reaches absolute knowing, in which the spirit sums itself up. There's a later book by Derrida on the spirit, which is more on Heidegger, but also looks a lot at Hegel. The sublation is sublated. It cancels the temporal dimension, allowing for its progress. Spirit comes to the endless enjoyment of itself in its absolute and absurd position of itself. Derrida is suspicious of this easy dialectization, and one can say that this is what he's trying to suggest, and remember from the start, by having side by side different positions, different texts, different corpuses, different problematics, is trying to suggest that you cannot easily unify them with a single dialectical treatment. In position, same time as Hegel's family, if there were a definition of difference, it would be precisely the limit, the interruption, the destruction of Hegelian sublation everywhere it operates. I want to insist on this because, as you can see, this shows that Derrida goes a little further than Blanchot here in their combined, converging readings of Hegel. Blanchot never stresses the theme of dialectics, but he never rejects this. Why is it something that Derrida questions? It is because a certain easy Hegelianism, and especially a Marxist Hegelianism, as represented, say, by thinkers like Georg Lukács and a few others, insist upon the category of totality. And Marxist dialectics is Hegelian in the sense that it just takes into consideration material conditions of production, the economy, and so on, class division, labor. But all this is in Hegel, and consider this from the point of view of totality. At the time Derrida was writing, Lucien Goldman, who was a disciple of Lukács, was also in Paris, often attacking those he called the structuralists, and always in the name of dialectics, totality, totality, totality. This was a sort of key word, the motto of people who were generally on the side of the Communist Party and who were close to Derrida in a sense, close to Althusser, but Derrida always rejected this easy, for him, glib notion of dialectics and so on. At least this is what he does. In that sense, one can find parallel. Deleuze, Lyotard, or Michel Serres, indeed. Deleuze, more precisely, or maybe somebody we haven't mentioned perhaps enough, Foucault. Foucault, even though he fought with Derrida about the question of madness, he too would say that he had never been Hegelian. He didn't want to be Hegelian, and so on. And so, along the complex dialectical path that defines Hegel's system of encyclopedic, Derrida pays particular attention to a number of difficult moments. So here, I will not go into all the details because basically for all this, what one needs to do, I did that. It was quite fun, I would say, with a good group of graduate students. I taught that class twice and had to stop it because the first time I have 20 students, the second time 50 students, and it was really impossible to manage. And I thought, okay, next time will be 200. I can't do it. But we were just taking the Phenomenology of Spirit in English with the various translations, in German, and various commentaries and so on. And this text is almost infinite, written at full speed by Hegel, full of insights, extremely opaque, obscure, jumping, returning, and so on. But there's a sort of pleasure. And I would say I had said this maybe in a sort of bold assertion when I wrote a little book on the future of theory a long time ago, more than 20 years ago. My contention was that if one wants to understand literary theory, one should just read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and then the many, many readings that followed it. If you can do that, you will understand a lot of theory. It's not so easy to do, but it is not at all impossible. It is, after all, a philosophical text that one can read, and there's no ownership of its meaning. And so I suggest this somehow as a test of your capacities or abilities to engage with theory. Read that philosophical text. I could also have, named Spinoza's Ethics as a second text that can be used as such in order to see whether you can follow a philosophical text from beginning to end. So here, of course, this text allows Derrida to pose many questions. The question of family, philosophical status of language, emerging from sound, the relation between Christianity and Judaism, with a striking suggestion that from a Hegelian point of view, Kant is structurally speaking Jewish. We'll come back to that. This idea that, and we know that Freud was very close to Kant and didn't like Hegel. And indeed, in Hegel, you have a Christian logic at work, and the links of Antigone and the family and the treatment of Africa. And none of this is presented as a refutation of Hegel. And there is a sort of inner Africa. More recently, Habib, a very good critic who was at Rutgers University, has written very well on Hegel as underpinning literary theory. And he points out, of course, the huge spots of blindness in Hegel those blind spots that have to do with Africa and other countries and so on. If we extract the logical schema of the analysis, it belongs to the an unconscious, which cannot be dialectized as such, as no history stands stubbornly on the threshold of the historical dialectical process. But this non-dialecticity, this ahistoricity, can always be interpreted as negativity, the resistance proper to the dialectical economy, and henceforth in turn as a speculative process. A certain undecidability of the fetish leaves us oscillating between the dialectic of the undecidable and the dialectic, or an undecidability between the dialectic and the undecidable. As you can see here, Derrida replaces often dialectic with undecidable. You don't know, you cannot. You stop the dialectical movement. But one needs to understand the idea of the Aufhebung, which is so central. So the two new translators insist upon the fact that the formal innovation is indeed what we can see as the most perhaps obfuscating device. That is, we don't know what to read each column. We should not forget the distance traveled from 1965, when the word hypertext first appeared in print, through Douglas Engelbart demonstrated hypertext in 1968, to the development of the contemporary technology. Derrida was blissfully unaware of it as he toiled with scissors and glue a la William Burroughs to graft, cultivate, and bring to bloom his textual hybrid. And indeed, it's quite important to know that he paid attention, as is obvious, but as we know, the setting of the text changes because the translation is at times longer, and in a new translation, you don't have the same pagination as the first one and as the original. Whereas, of course, in order to see exactly what Derrida had in mind, you have to look at the French original to see the spacing. This is also Derrida's work with Mallarmé, and I haven't talked enough about Mallarmé, but I have to say that Derrida, when I had all those conversations with him, was always pointing me back to Un coup de dé, a throw of the dice will never abolish chance. That was also composed by Mallarmé with a very precise typography in mind and the spacing on a double page. So as we know from earlier texts by Derrida on Mallarmé, he reproduces a Mallarmian play with the letters and the sounds. From a book by Robert Greer-Cohn on Mallarmé's coup de dé, Derrida had understood very early that for Mallarmé, it was not simply, as Mallarmé would say, the spacing of the text that was a novelty, but the fact that each letter of the font type, whether you choose bold, italics, and so on, could have a certain meaning, and that a V could be like a vagina, same, and an F would be, or an L would be upright, phallic, and so on. Sort of Freudian literalism of the signifier. And you find a lot of this in the way Derrida describes his own writing. At the same time, the biological and floral emphasis, word flowers, this is more the side of Genet. Since Genet's name contained the bloom of that wild flower, broom, it is, there's a whole discourse on fertilization, germination, generation, vegetation, pullulation, luxuriation, sensualization, sexualization, and so on. And indeed, it is something that one finds in Finnegan's Wake, as described by Samuel Beckett. Beckett said in Finnegan's Wake, the endless interaction between the languages is a constant germination. And this is what Genet does. Genet hadn't read Finnegan's Wake. Obviously, he didn't read English, but his work, especially in the poems and in some passages of the text, and the fact that he is first and perhaps most important, Notre Dame des Fleurs, Lady of the Flowers, and all the flower metaphors of his poem. There's a new type of plant or flower ontology, as if promoting a botanical animism. And so, of course, flower, and maybe more so in French than in English, but it's the same meaning, is the flowers of rhetorics. Flower, les fleurs de la rhétorique. There's a famous text by Jean Payan, Les Fleurs de Tarbes, in which he attacks the question of rhetorics, a text that impacted Blanchot. Blanchot responded to this, and Payan starts from a sort of joke. He saw in the small city in France of Tarbes one day a sign in front of a public garden and saying, one is a prohibition, there is a prohibition to bring flowers into the garden. So he takes this as a sort of metaphor about you cannot bring new rhetorical tropes to literature. And so all this is on the side of Genet's, as they say, vegetal incest, flowers and odors, wisteria, wine, and rosebush, and many, and so there's also in Genet one novel called The Miracle of the Rose. And in the reading of Genet, the Thief's Journal and all the Querelle de Brest and so on that are quoted, Genet indeed is paying attention to the sonorities of the words all the time. And so that's the other side, if you want, which provides a sort of commentary on Hegel. I'll stop here this long and very interesting presentation. So they end by saying clang. To translate the French, glas. It's important to know that indeed, even though G-L-A-S in French could be pronounced glass, so if we are German, in German, glass with a capital G, same spelling, would mean the glass like in English, but only one S. So could be glass, but no, the glas, the bell ringing, but it's mostly the bell ringing for death, the death knell. That's how it can be translated, death knell. Like the event it refers to, when the word glas is pronounced, it begins at a guttural, quasi-metallic, perhaps even industrial clamor or pure noise, and ends in the type of crystalline, vocalic sonority of music. In that way, the French word can be heard as having two parts of it, glass, glas, like the two columns of Derrida's text. And indeed, Hegel is often signing gl. So I'll just go on faster. The 1986 translation of Glas by John P. Levy and Richard Rand was an extraordinary labor of erudition. It is true. I met them at the time, and I said, how could you do this? It's extraordinary. Derrida expressed his own demonstration and friendship and gratitude in the preface to Glassary. If you're interested, you can take a look at this book that is an annotation of Glas. Now approaching 35 years later, 15 years since Derrida's text, we believe that his 1970 work is able to function differently. I think they are right. I think any important translation will not live more than 25, 30 years. One has to retranslate all the time. This is the paradox of translation. And I could not go into all the details, but indeed what they've done is at times closer to the text, at times understands a few things better, although there is nothing, as I was saying, wrong with the previous translation. They give again a number of explanations, because indeed, this is the text that is the most experimental, the most modernist of Derrida. It has been compared with Finnegan's Wake, although I don't think it is like Finnegan's Wake. It is also a philosophical text, but there are a number of terms that are often used. Bandé, which is almost impossible to translate, because in French slang, it means to have a hard-on, and then to bind. So complicated, often used in portmanteau word. Déjà, or repeated by Derrida as a signet or signature, inverting his initial, because in French, if you have the letter J for Jacques and D for Derrida, you pronounce J, D, and if you invert them, déjà. Je mec. So this is where perhaps the initial idea came from. A fragment Derrida extracts from je n'ai. It could be the beginning of various reflecting verbal clauses that je m'écris, je m'écoeure, je m'écroule. Mec is a common slang for guy, but more masculine is for the English for, it's derived from macaro, argot from pimp. Famously, that double column text ends on one side that je mec, and we don't know what je n'ai. Je n'ai played a lot with this first letter for a word that is then by apocope doesn't give you saint. So this one I mentioned already, saint, signet. So you see this strange word in French, saint is pronounced the same as saint breast. It evokes sang, blood. It is an anagram of sign, which keys into Derrida rewriting of signification as a function of signature effects. And then finally, one word that is really impossible to translate into English, tomber, ou tombe. The syntax of that verb that is so common in French. Il tombe, la pluie tombe. It's now raining, I see, ça tombe, I can say in French. But tombe is the tomb. Mallarmé played a lot with that. Tomber, to fall. In the third person of the present tense, tombe, it becomes a homonym for tomb. We have opted for the portmanteau neologism tomb fall, where both those senses are mobilized. And so here you have, see, that text, what remained of a Rembrandt, torn into small, quite regular squares and tossed into the shit can. That was the text that is found in Tel Quel, and that Derrida read with passion. And in that text, it is indeed what Genet describes. Genet was supposed to write a book on Rembrandt, and he begins to write it, and then he couldn't do it. And then he tore it apart, kept just a few pages, and put it down the toilet, which is quite interesting. In Genet, we know there was this fact that Genet, who had been raised in institutions and so on, very early became a thief and a maid prostitute, and was jailed and so on. We'll return to that biographical basis. And Genet's attitude facing his publishers, mostly Gallimard, Édition Gallimard, was often to get huge advances for books he tried to write, but then he couldn't write. And then would not deliver. And there's a famous anecdote with another press when the owner of the press, exasperated, screamed at Genet, "But you are a thief." And Genet said, "Yes, exactly, I am a thief." And so Genet was aware of that. And so you can see here, I will stop my partage, because I want to look at the text you have. and this was just a fragment, but the text of Gla that you have in the first translation, to just point out a few issues and a few questions. Of course, it's endless, and I want to leave some time for a conversation, because indeed I can understand we are sharing, right? You see it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Good. So I just take rapidly a number of passages, a number of points to show how this works. So if I can go down, scroll down. So I will begin with page. If you have it, you can also take a look on your own computers. 66 to 70 to show how important, I would say, both sides of the text are, and how they comment on each other, and in a very original manner. And okay, so you see here the insertion of something on the gift and so on. One can say, so why can I say that this is Derrida's masterpiece? It is a text, if one looks at it closely, that contains all the insights that he will develop in the next 20 years or so. And so here, page 66, you have on the left an analysis of Hegel. And this is something that has fascinated me, not with the same text, actually. I have worked on this with Hegel's Philosophy of Nature, which surprisingly is a text that Derrida barely mentions, but that's not part of his canon so much. And on blood and the transformation of Christ's blood into a symbol, the banquet, this is my body, hoc enim corpus meum, and this is, and we see that here you have this little insert is Derrida's analysis. He inserts something, double posture, double postulation, contradiction in itself of two irreconcilable desires. Here I give it, accused in my own tongue, the title Double Bands, double band. Remember, in French, it means double erection as well. Putting them into form and into play practically. A text laces in two senses, in two directions, twice skirt, band, contraband. It's a very good translation. Band, contrebande, same in French. And so the long analysis of the text is, it goes back to Plato's pharmacy, as we can see. And we see that some of the passages in insert are really Derrida glossing his own activity, while on the left he is commenting on Hegel. And we see this page 68, 70, along, as you can see, analysis of wine, blood, spirit, and so on. And what is important here, and you can see how it does it, you have here also on the left, sort of serious sacred analysis of transubstantiation, the mystery at the heart of Christianity, fact that communion, and Hegel is always meditating on this, is the transformation of the body of Christ, the bread and the wine. And Hegel, one can say, is a Christian philosopher, there's no denying it. And here we have Genèse, pagan, gay, sexuality. Here, for the erection in a downy being of his writing, that is not very well translated. Être à poil is slang to be naked, to be in a nude. Derision does not simply make the erection fall. It keeps the erection erect, but does so by submitting the erection, but it keeps the erection from already the crap of the proper, du non propre, the proper no, and not made. Apotropaic incantation of the resida, derisory erection of the gladiolus. So it's a meditation, one can say, on male and female sexuality inside the logic of Hegelian appropriation of absolute knowledge. Gravely, imperturbably, the author split with laughter. In French again, very slangy, ce poil. It's something, it's a feature of Genet style, which is so good that often Genet, who had a very, I would say, lofty practice of French language. Genet was an abandoned child who was educated very well by good teachers and learned the French of the books. And he could write poetry like Mallarmé, if you want. At the same time, he lived in the slums. He had no money. He had to be prostituted. He had to steal. He went to the French Legion, but had terrible experiences there. And so until, one might say, the middle of the Second World War, he was a sort of destitute thief, prostitute, and so on, conscious of his objection. And it's a notion that Kristeva has developed, but he was quite aware of that. And I want to show this because one can see this page. We have the question of the I realize that this is not exactly the same text I have. There is an insertion of Freud on femininity that is inserted, and we can see that Derrida really reads Hegel with Freud in mind. I realize that I don't have the same pagination. I'm trying to find it here. And okay, so one can say that he, for instance, inserts elements that have to do with the gift, for instance, and with the logic of the gift that will be the topic of one book given time. And so, yes, I realized that I took my notes on the new translation. So I will have to go a little faster. Yes, that's why we don't have exactly the same. But then say that after this long analysis of blood and on the Genet side, you have the reference to Plato's teaching to the pharmacy. So basically, Derrida also recaps his earlier texts and essays on Plato. He then goes on about the question of Hegel. In Hegel, the question of medicine, the body, and one has to see that Hegel is indeed one of the first philosophers who wanted to have, I would say, Aristotle and Hegel somehow have the same ambition to cover absolutely everything in the name of a certain philosophical logic. Of course, Hegel began with a meditation on Christianity, and that for him was a way of understanding the what he calls the logic of reciprocity that he saw at the heart of Christianity, and the logic of love. That love was also human love and the family. So the which leads us to the way in which for Genet, and a text that Derrida doesn't quote, and I think would have worked very well, is a text about how not to think abstractly, that ends with the beheading of a criminal. In Genet, you have, especially in Miracle of the Rose, this weird autobiographical text in which Genet talks about being in jail. And Genet, who is presented as Genet in the text, falls in love, and you have it here, Miracle of the Rose. The author of a beautiful poem is always dead. And yes, see, I am DJ, I am already dead behind it. Genet, is obsessed with both, you might say, Catholic religion. I am following the Immaculate Conception, Holy Mother, and at the same time with the idea of the phallus and the murderer. In Miracle of the Rose, and just to give you an example, you have Genet talking about being in jail. He went to two types of jail, Maître, as a young boy, a penal colony, and Fontevraud prison. In Fontevraud, he fell in love with a prisoner, Arcamon, which is probably an invented name, who was condemned to death and beheaded for murder, was a murderer. He writes about him, the rare occasions when he sees him. Genet was in Maître between 1926 and 1929. And it's funny in a way, because what we can see, and so this was the element that Sartre pointed out. For Sartre, Genet was somebody who had been mistreated by his family, by society, had been sent to jail, and then decided to become the enemy. We see it, and then indeed, Genet, in perhaps one of the most sublime, but also most disquieting texts of Genet, Pompe funèbre, funeral rites, but one has to know that in French, pompe means the sexual meaning, blowjob. So very typical of Genet. We have at the end the passage, and some of you may know it because it has been extremely well discussed by a good friend of mine who passed away recently, Leo Bersani, in Homos, meditation on Genet. You have Hitler who arrives, and the narrator who begins by stating his mourning for Jean de Carnin, his lover who had been killed by the Nazis, in the end ends up being sodomized by Hitler in a sort of frantic allegory of the destruction of France and so on. So Genet was really on the side of the enemy. And in that sense, I want to insist on this because, see, he can appear indeed as the opposite of Hegel, and at the same time, they are not dialectical opposites. And what Derrida is always trying to do is to show that in the writing of Genet, close to psychoanalysis, close to issues of sexuality, you can then, using this as a sort of launching pad to reread Hegel, who at times tries to talk about Antigone, the family, and so on. I think I'll have to go a little faster here and say simply that in the Hegel text, you have a whole meditation on Freud and on Kant. Now, I mentioned that rapidly, but fundamentally through this notion that Kant is presented as the point of departure for Hegel. And in Kant, you have a certain formalism of the law. And Hegel, and that's quite well known, compares Kant with Moses, sort of lawgiver who is in a kind of old dispensation. And he, Hegel, that's the early theological writings of Hegel, wants to bring about a new Christian dialectization of all these issues, introducing the idea of love, desire, and sexual difference as well. So this is in the analysis, the long analysis of Antigone in the middle of the phenomenology of spirit, that for Derrida is the key to Hegel. Not as Kojève wanted the dialectics of master and slave, not as Hippolyte saw it, terror in the French Revolution, but something that comes surprisingly later in Hegel's scheme, which is the analysis of what he calls the end of the Greek city, the end of the polis, the end of the Sittlichkeit, that is the morality as a sort of union of beliefs and consensus and so on, that according to Hegel collapses as woman emerges and femininity, a famous passage in Hegel about Antigone. Antigone embodies the irony of femininity, making fun of Creon, laughing at him, and bringing about the total collapse of the city of Thebes, because there was a Theban legend, Oedipus, and so on. Of course, Oedipus is behind all this, and that's Hegel's reading. We could spend hours discussing it, that for Hegel, there is a clash between the law of the male side and the law of the female side. And this clash is not necessarily, Hegel is not necessarily for Antigone. Why? Because he sees that Antigone, even though she is right from the point of view of her own ethics, embodies the dissolution of the unity of the spirit of the city. This is connected with this complicated, the Sittlichkeit. The term Sittlichkeit is hard to translate. It is not Moralität. It is more this institutional morality. But you have here, see, from Hegel, the problematic of Sittlichkeit. Here you have on the right the funeral rites. He fucks you, he comes here, and so on. I bugger the world. He rams it in, and so on. See, very shocking erotic language of Genet. He buggered soberly, and so on, Lady of the Flowers. See, it's a little as if you were to put side by side, one could do it, and Lacan was tempted to do it, Kant's first and third critiques, and Sade's texts about orgies, tortures, and so on. This is a little what Derrida is doing. At the same time, because of the Hegelian background, Derrida reads the text of Genet as constructed on a number of anxieties, worries about the erection, about death, about criminality. And I would say that at the end, we have a lot about Hegel and the death of Hegel, and the fact that Hegel, you'll see it, and you may have seen it already, when Hegel was dying, famously on his deathbed, he was asked, what he had to say. And he said, well, in fact, there was only one person who understood me, and then he did not even understand me. So nobody understood Hegel. And at the same, this is connected with quotes from Genet's a strange text published in Tel Quel, The Curious World of, and it is urbanism, in which Genet imagines that we want to have more cemeteries in cities and that we will have a theater in the middle of the tombs. Weird fantasy of the later Genet that Derrida liked and that he quotes and that he understands via Hegel as well. Genet was a very, very strange writer, I have to say. But what can be shocking for some readers, and I have to say, I still remember when I was, that's Genet's signature, Jean Genet. Reading Genet is quite shocking. It's all about gay sex and so on. And at the same time, Derrida tries to talk about the what he calls the logic of flowers. And at some point, he mentions the logic of parenthesis, but he writes it with an A. Anthesis means the flowering period of a plant, see? And so all those flowers that appear in Genet's text are obviously erections, ejaculations, and so on. And you have this floral pharynome. And here, Derrida works a lot on kind of biology, fertilization, cryptography, and so on. And indeed, he tries to follow a number of signifiers. And here he's mentioning Czechoslovakia, where Genet went, but he too went. And the fact that that's one of the things he insists a lot on. In Genet's novel, there was this tough man, a pimp, Stilitano, who has always added a sort of prosthesis, a flower inside. So he doesn't have an erection, but he makes everybody believe he has an enormous erection. And it is just, he just adds something that he grafts on his trousers somehow. So Derrida discusses at some point this kind of fake erection, as it were, in Genet. And when Genet, the character, discovers that it is not an erection, but just a prosthesis. And so to conclude on this, I'll end with the last passages in which you have, see, Freud, what happened to the two, the merry-go-round and religion. So Hegel is, I would say, caught via Freud. Again, it's a sort of Freudian reading of Hegel. Genet is really understood via a sort of biological floral logic, although you also see a number of references to Kant and to Sartre. So that's the last point I'd like to make. Sartre and the critique of Sartre. And the critique of Sartre, I think, explains why Derrida wanted to write that book. Again, Sartre had written this kind of enormous book on Genet, giving a dialectics of Genet's life and work. And there's a chapter called Genet's Failure. And this is how Derrida commented. Genet's Failure, what a title. A magical, animistic, scared denunciation. What is the sought after effect? Hasn't Genet always calculated the failure? He repeats it all the time. He wanted to make a success of failure. And now, for a simple provocation of his text, he constructs a scene that obliges the other to unmask, to stammer, to become unhinged, to say what he wouldn't have wanted to, should not have said. In this text, the text Genet that traps flashes, read the reader, judgment, criticism, like Rembrandt, paradigmatic scene. Here again, I would say that in this book, you have the most direct confrontation with Sartre. And unlike Robert Doran, who wrote a very good piece in the Understanding Derrida I edited, I think I disagree slightly with Robert, who's a good friend, because I think he sees Derrida as little unfair and mean facing Sartre and so on. I would say that even though I like Sartre's book on Genet, it's obsessive, it's enormous. We know that Sartre spent a lot of time with Genet, and Genet was talking, and Sartre writing frantically. So a lot of that book was indeed partly written by Genet. However, it has a sort of dialectical sweep and so on. What Derrida does is to show with this counterexample that one cannot talk of things like success or the failure of Genet. He rejects that. In another passage, he mentions Sartre as a dialectical animal, and he makes fun of Sartre dialectic. And so, he quotes Sartre, the interesting aspect of Jean Genet does not reside in his poetic power, but in the lesson we can learn from his weakness. There is, I don't know what, a fragile, friable quality in Genet's writing, which does not necessarily prevent us from admiring him, but which makes us hesitate to agree with him. Derrida, I don't know what, critique of the I don't know what, the heart truly is not there. And then it's a violent rejection of Sartre, I have to say. And one has to see this. And he's trying to offer a counter method, a non-dialectical reading. Right? And then here you have the language of flowers, the glas, and he quotes a poem, an erotic poem by Bataille. For him, Bataille is a better heir or a better guide to read Genet. And so here I say what he rejects is everything of the metaphysics of authenticity, ownership, property, mastery, using simulacrum, expropriation, loss, major laughter, and so on. Of course, we haven't had time to discuss Derrida's confrontation with Bataille, but I would say that he uses, here's the passage I was mentioning from Michael Pretorius about organ, the organographia. As you can see, it is important to see it as corresponding with nothing in the other column. Of course, this is the practice of castration. It's a text that keeps castrating and erecting itself, following the Freudian Lacanian logic. The undecidable, isn't it the undeniable? You cannot deny the undecidable. This is what he opposes to Sartre's easy psychobiography. However, one could say, and so this is the funny twist, and he was quite aware of that, that in the Hegel column, Derrida is almost producing a psychobiography of Hegel, although he interrupts it every time it seems to reach a sort of absolute position and so on. And so this is why, and the last point I wanted to mention, and then I hope we have time for a discussion. We can take a little more time if you want. Here is where Derrida quotes Beckett without any reference. You have to know Beckett, but those of you, it's significant that Molloy, in order to replace Mag with some name or other, should choose entirely by chance the title Countless Caca. So this famous passage in which Molloy talks about his mother and said he could not call her mother, but calls her Mag, because for me, without my knowing why, the letter G abolished the syllable ma, and as it were, spat on it better than on any other letter would have done. At the same time, I satisfied a deep and doubtless unacknowledged need, the need to have a ma, that is a mother, and to proclaim it audibly. For before you say mag, you say ma, inevitably. And da in Padre word means father. Beside for me, the question did not arise. At the period I'm worming into now, I mean the question of whether to call her ma, mag, or countless kaka, for she having for countless years been as deaf as a post. It's the only quote of Beckett, long quote here, but quite revealing because it tells us of the kind of spirit Beckett works in, playing with the signifier, ma, kaka, and so on. Dirty, if you want, the sacred link between the son and the mother, and just by the insertion of one letter. This is also the letter of gla, mag, gla, and so on. Like what links here Beckett and Derrida is their joint rejection of Sartrean dialectics. Would be too long to show. I've tried to do so in a book on Beckett, Think Pig. Beckett really had no patience for Sartrean dialectics. And in the same way, in this later book, Derrida settles his account with Sartre and any kind of dialectical analysis that would try to use or misread Hegel, because of course Sartre was always going back to Hegel, Marx, and misunderstood Heidegger. And so I just end here with the ending. See, we have reached absolute knowledge, but where is this? Through a spiritual work of art, reconciliation is announced. Through comedy, then, a time to perfect the resemblance between Dionysius and Christ. This is Nietzsche here. Between the two, already is elaborated in some the origin of literature, but it runs to its ruin, for it counted without, and you don't know what. And on the other side, the cracking wit of Herman is glossing a text. And here you have in the last page, I don't know whether you recognized this. This is the beautiful poem from the ending of Nietzsche's Zarathustra for the Sonnenaufgang. If you know it, beautiful passage. It's quoted again in German without any reference. Also, what I had read it naturally already republishes itself today, here, now, the debris of, and it stops. So there is no synthesis. There is just a cut and interruption. So having said this, I hope you have a few questions. I know it's a little overwhelming to work with GLA. It's a tricky text, but I really recommend its perusal. One cannot, let's say, read it like any normal book from beginning to end, and it doesn't matter. I think it's the same effect that Finnegan's Wake creates. That is, you don't understand much, but then you keep on playing, you turn the pages, and you see this extraordinary analysis and insert, and very funny, very witty, and also very bawdy, very obscene, and so on, which is quite surprising in a book of philosophy.
So if there are questions, please feel free to either type out or unmute yourself. Thank you so much, Jean-Michel. That was such a great range of so many things we discussed, but I'll hold on to my comments for, let's have the questions first if we have. Yeah.
Sure. And you can be also resistant, and some people don't like GLA. There are people who say, no, this was really a mistake, and indeed it's a unique attempt. He didn't go on, Derrida didn't go on with this kind of experimental text after that. For many reasons, he returned to, I would say, a more traditional kind of long texts on a topic, a philosophical topic, like the death penalty, ethics, and so on. And with a mixture of readings of literary texts and philosophical texts, but never tried again to do something that was, in a way, poetic. In a sense, there is a poetic dimension in that book, which is that every page is composed in view of its, I would say, spatial interactions, commenting each other. Does gla means death in English? Death.
नॉर्मली कोई आता है आके ना दूर करने
Sorry, somebody. Yeah. Gla means if you
Dr. Geeta, could you please mute yourself? For some strange reason, I can't seem to be able to mute you. Could you please mute yourself? There's noise coming in from your end. Thank you.
Gla, if you look at a dictionary, is exactly death knell. See? It's the bell tolling in a cemetery when there is a burial. See? That's gla. Gla has, I think, an onomatopoeic element in French. You hear a sort. This is why Wills and Bennington decided to translate by clang, because at the end I skipped that. There's a long meditation of Hegel on the statue of Menon, that when struck by the sun, a bronze statue would produce and heated a strange noise that was considered as a sort of manifestation of the god, if you want. And so Hegel discusses this at some length, why clang and so on. But it's the bell tolling in the graveyard announcing death. It's sort of, yeah, mean death. In French, le glas, for whom Hemingway's novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, is translated into French as Pour qui sonne le glas. That's, I mean, people who may not know that word generally know the title of this famous novel. So le glas means, yeah, the death and the bed. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question just before that from Parul.
Oh, sorry, I haven't seen. Yes, yes, about Blanchot. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I told you have it. The meaning of the poem comes from that. Ingitur Majarme, Sage de absolutely referring to Hamlet trickery. Can we relate theatricality to the untranslatability of the poem and the excess, where the resistance to meaning making could be staged? Death would reflect the negative space of the heart of original poem. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that trickery is so inevitably linked with your analysis, but I agree. If you know Igitur in Mallarmé, it all begins with a certain death. The death of Saint John the Baptist, Wilde's play, Herodiade, and maybe also Hamlet. But I think you have many different themes here. In Mallarmé's reading of Hamlet, as you may know, a famous reading that had been, okay, let me, I lost your, in Mallarmé's reading of Hamlet, he says that Hamlet is the stagnant exagération du meurtre. Sort of, he sees Hamlet as a sort of bloodbath at the end. Everybody dies almost. And so for this, we would have to look at the way Joyce rewrites Mallarmé's reading of Hamlet in the library discussion of Stephen Dedalus presenting Hamlet as a sort of British soldier shooting everybody, and typical of the British imperialism and so on. So Joyce has a very funny analysis that sends us back to this idea of death, murder, theatricality. I'm not sure here, but perhaps it would be too long. The idea of trickery. It's in Derrida, you have a meditation on, let's say, mime, the mime in Mallarmé, and how Mallarmé discusses a number of prose poems, the La pénultième est morte, and so on, the idea or the idea of the spectacle. But for Mallarmé, the spectacle is not trickery. You need spectacle. You need, so literature is also some form of spectacle. And theatricality, I don't think is the same as untranslatability, but these are two important notions, absolutely. Yes, so going through the scan version, I was extremely confused with the layout of glass. It is confusing. It was when you held up the actual square book that it hit me that, so these were the columns you were talking about. I was apparently looking at the tiny comment. I see. I hope that you have the scan version as two columns, right? I mean, yeah. The two columns, if you want, I mean, this is the complication of this book. As I told you, once I used it to teach a class on Hegel, so we only read the left column. Another time I taught a class on Beckett and Genet, we only used the right column. You can ignore the other side. If you're just interested in Genet, you have a real book on Genet, and the book on Genet starts by quoting a number of themes, deploying them, presenting a certain reading, the role of birth, flowers, and a certain, you might say, organicity of language in Genet, I would say, then which is read in a very Freudian, or let's say in Derrida, I would say Torokian, Torokian kind of, it's a little Derrida producing for Genet what Torok and Abraham were doing with the Wolfman, sort of word hoard of Genet, and the keywords for Genet, and how they irradiate and are found in many different texts, and how they tend to be organized with phonological determinations, gl being one of these. Derrida liked a lot the linguist called Fonagyi, Hungarian, who was insisting on certain primitive sounds. And I don't think he knew her, but if you know the work of Sabina Spielrein, very interesting psychoanalyst who was a friend of Jung first and then of Freud, in Sabina Spielrein, she also discusses why is it that most languages have the same sounds for mother and father, ma, da, fa, ma, pa, pa, and da, da, all those words. So why is it? Is there, is there something that has to do with the evolution of language throughout the world, or is it something that has to do with the libidinal structure of the body? And we tend to pronounce ma to talk about that, our links to the breast, to the primal interaction, da, and so on. So he liked that. Yes, there is a question about Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was in fear and trembling. Abraham has sacrificed. Yes, absolutely. To assume absolute responsibility. There is an aporia between Abraham's duty in general and duty to God. Building on Kierkegaard, Derrida asserts in Gift of Death, what can be said about Abraham's relation to God can also be said about my relation without relation to every other as wholly other. And indeed, it is the question on the unsettling nature of absolute responsibility and its impact on ethics in relation to Derrida's proclamation that deconstruction is justice. Yes, and as you may know, one of the things that Derrida, in Force de Loi, Force of Law, stated. He said, justice cannot be deconstructed. It's because of that deconstruction is justice, as it were. In Gift of Death, Derrida is responding to Patočka, who was already meditating on Kierkegaard and Fear and Trembling. It is indeed something that interests all of us, at least a strong reading of Kierkegaard, who meditates on this idea that Abraham is in the purely religious realm because his agreement to the sacrifice of his son, following God's order, entails silence. He doesn't speak to anyone else. He acts. He doesn't speak because he cannot say anything somehow. And indeed, Abraham is not in the ethical world, and that's an interesting notion. I have worked on this more recently in connection with Kafka. As you may know, Kafka meditated quite systematically and in many texts, especially in some letters that are extraordinary on this paradox. And Kafka tries to refute Kierkegaard. We know that Kafka was, in a way, a reader of Kierkegaard, but disagreed with Kierkegaard, and invents other versions of Abraham. And Kafka invents an Abraham who cannot even leave his house to sacrifice his son because he has always something else to do, repair this, repair that, and always stays in a house. See, which I think has something to do as well with Blanchot and Derrida's notion of Kierkegaard. So in Bataille, there is the idea of sacrifice, yes, but I don't think Derrida would share that. Your question is regarding the unsettling nature of absolute responsibility. Yes, this is what Derrida keeps insisting on in the later texts, that there is a certain madness or undecidable moment at work, even in the question of absolute responsibility. And in that sense, is Abraham a model or not? See, Abraham must sacrifice ethics, but he must also sacrifice his son. That's the thing, to assume absolute responsibility. I have worked on a novel by Blanchot, à l'instant, au moment voulu, in which Blanchot restages the story of Abraham and Isaac in his own way, and meditates, thanks to this woman he was in love with at that time, meditates on the impossibility of the sacrifice and what it means to sacrifice oneself. This woman had sacrificed herself for Bataille, and Bataille, a little horribly, had just dumped her. And then she came back to Paris with her son. And in that strange novel, Blanchot mentions how this woman becomes a feminine version of Abraham. Take a look. It's in the, if you don't read French, it is in the Bataille, in the Station Hill Bataille reader, and you will see that. So there's another question about Saint-Signé. We need to answer. Signé as Saint-Bresson, yeah. As Saint-Bresson, anagram for sign. Is there a reference to Heidegger's sign? Of course. Saint. Derrida, absolutely. You've got it. Could not introduce Sein. As I mentioned, as you know, in the later text, Heidegger decided to rewrite Sein. As you may know about this word, it is something that Kafka noted, and I think it underpins what Derrida does with ça, S-A, savoir absolu. Kafka notes, he says, only in German do we have the same word to mean being, sein, and his, the possessive. And so also Kafka starts from this weird coincidence in German of the two signifiers. And so question, I wasn't wet today. Okay, so thank you, Arnab. And final question, you touched on it, the originator author. What does Derrida make about the debate around authorship? Yes, Barthes, Foucault, Benjamin on authors. This is something you should write about, Vicky, because it's a really interesting question. And not much has been done about it, not enough. The question of the author in Derrida, because as you know, there was this tension between Roland Barthes, who spoke of the death of the author, and Foucault, who responded immediately after and saying, we need the author, and so on, and the author, and so on. I don't think Derrida intervenes in this debate directly as to the author. As we've seen, he prefers to talk about signature. So why? Because what interests Derrida, and you know, when you, in today's meaning of author, you have authority. And again, you know, especially in the US, do you have the authority to do so? Do you need a signature for this or that? And so on. So something like authorize, see, I authorize the publication, but I don't authorize. Like we all of us who are scholars, we know at times we cannot publish certain things without the authorization of the family or the representatives, James Joyce Foundation, the James Joyce trustees, and so on. So authority for Derrida is it's something that Foucault doesn't really discuss. Foucault is trying to establish a new science. Barthes was trying to get rid of the idea of authorial intention. Derrida is interested in the performative effects of what an author's name means. See? And basically, as you can see, he is also interested, I would say, in a sort of anarchist or almost deconstructive and at times debunking of the idea of authority. And here he does it in Glas by taking the text of Hegel and ironizing it by having sperm, fuck, shit, and so on the other side, you see, which suddenly puts you in a different frame of mind. Are you reading philosophy when you talk about buggering and so on? No, but he's also seeing this in Hegel already, see? So he is undermining a sort of sacredness of the authority by posing the question of what is the performative gesture of somebody who signed, who says, I, Hegel, have reached absolute knowledge, or I, Hegel, do not believe in absolute knowledge, and so on, by showing that all this is in a layering of texts. And these texts are also texts that have a performative function and value. So you touch the origin of the author. Yes, that's it. That's so that it's not a concept, I would say, of Derrida, the idea of the author. At the same time, one can say that Derrida was quite aware of his being an author and having his own thinking. But I want to end maybe with this last notion. that Derrida, even though he's always stressing undecidability and indecision and so on, was the most precise and decisive and rigorous thinker I knew. And he wouldn't, in a conversation, you had to be extremely careful about the use of your words and the use of his words. And he knew exactly what he had said and written at a given time, even though he would profess his incompetence, oh, I don't know, the specialist. He was extremely in control of his language to be precisely because of all the performative effects. And so was not like somebody who writes a little randomly, not at all, not at all. And this is why he's always thinking about absolute knowledge. And to end, I would just quote this, which for me has always been a very helpful quote. It's when talking about Hegel, Heidegger, in a text on Hegel, who he didn't really like Hegel, Heidegger, but he discussed Hegel. For Heidegger, Hegel had a naive concept of time, time as history, not really interesting. His conception of history was not at all Heidegger's history. He said, nevertheless, by considering absolute knowledge as the telos, as the aim, the end, the aim of philosophy, Hegel teaches us not to believe in absolute knowledge, but to think absolutely, absolutely as an adverb, qualifying the verb think absolutely, which is not at all the same as a belief in absolute knowledge, as if history would be ended and there would be one philosopher who would have a response for all the questions. Obviously, this is not the case, and this is impossible. And if I can end with this, I would say that with Derrida, we have the same way of both thinking absolutely, but letting the questions rebound and having those texts that are open-ended. And so I hope that you will continue. That's all I can say. Thank you very much for all your good questions and your interest, and do keep in touch with me, and I'll be very willing to keep on the dialogue we have started, thanks to Arca. I want to thank Arca for organizing this. I hope it was not too grueling this week reading Derrida. And I hope that next time I'll be with you in a room and we'll be without masks and without any fear of any contagion. Thank you again. And
Yeah, I
we'll be
mean,
in touch.
just to finish off with a vote of thanks for you, Professor Rabate. It was wonderful to have you throughout the week and discussing in such great detail all the different readings of Derrida and all the different paradigms of reading that you opened up. Also, the question of at least certain practices of reading within Derrida being modernist in a certain sense, the modernist Derrida of the GLA, the experimentalist Derrida of the GLA. It was wonderful that you took us through all these extraordinary layers of reading, and I would like to thank the GIAN initiative, Global Initiative of Academic Networks. That's the full form, and IIT Gandhinagar, and of course, first and foremost, you for being so generous with your time and also answering every single question and every single sub question to the T. Thank you so much, and
you're welcome. And I'm adding my email. I'm not sure whether I can do it, but you're welcome to send my email to
I'll just
participants. Yeah. I have two emails, but jmrabate@gmail.com. And if you have other questions, because I know we've been covering so much around that, a lot remains to be done. But anyway, happily, good luck with your work and your reading. As you can see, Derrida is still relevant today. I would say there's a real need to rethink Derrida. And again, to last note, I do think that one needs to read the earlier text and the later text all together. There's no like selection to be made. So thank you again, and have a great year. We're going to celebrate Christmas and New Year. I'm not sure that this is exactly the same in India. And I'll be thinking of you soon, flying to Paris and with imagining a sort of India of my dreams. So thanks again.
Could I hold you back for a second though? I have just a logistical
Sure.
discussion, just for a
Yes,
couple of minutes. Yeah.
Of course.
Let me just